Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. The Feather Bed and the Straw Mattress. Layers of sleep in a cold stone keep. You're standing inside a medieval castle. The air is cold even in summer. The thick stone walls keep out invaders, but they don't keep out drafts. The floor is flagstone, swept but never quite clean. The single, narrow window lets in a sliver of moonlight. The room is hushed, and in the corner sits a bed simple yet clever. Its secrets lie in its layers. Let's begin at the base. Early medieval beds were rarely more than raised wooden platforms crafted to avoid the cold and pests on the floor. A wooden frame held together by pegs, ropes, or interlocked joints provided a sturdy surface, often with slats or ropes across the base. These ropes would sag over time, prompting the now-forgotten phrase, "sleep tight," a reminder to tighten the ropes before bed. Beneath the frame, some families stored chamber pots or tools. Above, a sleeping area was layered, much like how we might layer a cake, functional and necessary. The bottommost layer, straw. The tick, what went inside a mattress. The most common base layer for comfort was a large cloth sack called a tick, usually linen or canvas stuffed with straw. Straw was plentiful, inexpensive, and relatively easy to replace. Each autumn, households would gather the chaff from the harvest to refill their ticks before the cold months set in. Straw mattresses weren't exactly plush. They were noisy, scratchy, and prone to mold or rot if not aired properly. Worse, they attracted bedbugs and mice. But for many, the alternative, bare wood or cold stone, was worse. A well-stuffed straw tick, when fluffed and freshly filled, provided a surprising degree of comfort. These were placed atop a rope base or, in finer homes, on slatted wood, adding a degree of separation from the cold below. Some castles experimented with different stuffing, dried leaves, hay, or even moss. In wealthier homes, hops were added for a fragrant aroma. In monasteries, dried herbs such as lavender and wormwood were stuffed into mattresses to deter pests and promote relaxation. Feathers and flocks, luxury layers for the wealthy. Above the straw mattress lay something softer, a feather bed, also known as a feather tick. This was essentially another sack, similar to the straw tick but filled with goose or duck feathers. Featherbeds were a mark of wealth and status, often passed down as heirlooms. To collect enough feathers for one full bed, it could take dozens of birds, usually gathered during annual plucking, a process done carefully to avoid harming the animals. The feather tick was laid directly atop the straw mattress, acting like a cushion and insulation layer in one. Flock scraps of wool or fabric were sometimes mixed in with the feathers to add volume or reduce cost. This blend provided a balance between support and softness. For wealthier households, multiple featherbeds might be layered, creating a cloud-like sleeping experience far removed from the harshness of the stone around them. Blankets and counterpanes, wrapping up for warmth. The topmost layers mattered just as much. Medieval bedding included woolen blankets, linen sheets, and in some cases, animal pelts. Linen sheets were labor-intensive to produce and thus valuable. They were often bleached in the sun, scrubbed with ashes, and scented with herbs. Wool blankets trapped heat, while furs, fox, rabbit, or even bear provided insulation for the coldest months. Counterpanes, decorative bed coverings, were sometimes used in noble households, embroidered with family crests or religious imagery. But in most homes, warmth took precedence over beauty. Covering everything was often a canopy or curtain, not merely decorative but a practical tool to trap body heat. Some beds were enclosed, entirely box beds, in certain regions, ensuring warmth and privacy. Nightwear and skin contact. The person sleeping in this multi-layered nest might not be in what we think of as pajamas. Nightshirts were common among the wealthy, a loose, long garment usually made of linen. Peasants might sleep in the same clothes they wore during the day, or in nothing at all, especially if garments were wet or soiled from labor. Clean skin was thought to be more susceptible to illness, especially if exposed to cold air. Thus, layering became crucial. Even indoors, sleeping was a bundled endeavor, often with socks, caps, and gloves. Sleep in shifts, night interrupted. Sleep itself wasn't a single uninterrupted affair. Medieval people frequently practiced segmented sleep, 2 stretches of slumber divided by an hour or 2 of wakefulness in the middle of the night. During this time, people might pray, stoke the fire, check on livestock, or even socialize quietly. This period, called the watch, also allowed for the refluffing of bedding or the shifting of straw if discomfort had settled in. Sleep hygiene as we understand it didn't exist. Yet, the practice of refreshing bedding, storing mattresses in daylight, or rotating the stuffing were common and passed down traditions. Who slept where? Social hierarchies in sleep. In castles, sleeping arrangements reflected power. The lord and lady had the warmest, most comfortable rooms, often above the great hall. Their bed was sometimes shared with children, servants, or even guests. Privacy was limited. Servants and guards might sleep near doorways, in stairwells, or even on benches. Straw mattresses laid directly on the floor were common. In winter, they might wrap themselves in their cloaks or lay close to a hearth for warmth. In some areas, multiple people shared beds out of necessity and warmth. The heat of a second or third body was considered a blessing during long, bitter winters. The life cycle of a mattress. Straw mattresses didn't last long. By spring, they would be flattened, pungent, and filled with unwanted tenants. Annual beating days were organized to empty, clean, and refill bedding. Feathers were shaken out and spread to air, then restuffed carefully. Ticks were repaired, resewn, or replaced. This cyclical nature of bedding maintenance reveals a surprising truth. Medieval people knew their sleep mattered. Even if the method seemed primitive, the effort they invested in making rest comfortable, even luxurious, speaks volumes about resilience and adaptation. And yet, with all these layers, from straw to feathers to wool, from linen to fur to hide, from rope beds to canopy curtains, was it ever enough? The medieval bed was more than a place to rest. It was a social marker, a strategic asset, and in many ways, a symbol of a household's wealth and order. While the first section introduced the physical composition of the medieval bed, this second chapter delves into its cultural and social dimensions, how beds conveyed status, how they were used in diplomacy and daily logistics, and how even the act of sleep was entwined with power, ritual, and survival. Where you slept was who you were. Beds were not tucked away as private sanctuaries. In fact, in many noble households, beds were publicly displayed. They were moved to the great hall during the day or set up behind wooden screens, not just for privacy, but to make a statement. For nobles, the bedchamber was often an extension of the audience hall. Here, close advisors and important guests were received not sitting in chairs, but often gathered near or upon the bed itself. These were not simply sleeping quarters. They were political spaces where decisions were made, and loyalty was measured by proximity. A well-constructed, elaborately draped bed signified more than wealth. It reflected connections, craftsmanship, and lineage. The ability to host someone in a richly adorned bed was a demonstration of hospitality and status. Crafting prestige, the bed as art. Bed making was an artisan's work. Carpenters, blacksmiths, and textile workers all played a role. Beds were built with strong wood, oak, or chestnut, and in noble homes, often carved with intricate designs or family heraldry. Canopies and bed curtains, often dyed in expensive colors like deep blue or crimson, were hand-woven or embroidered. Linen sheets were bleached and carefully stored. Furs were stitched together with care. These were not only functional objects, they were heirlooms. In many noble wills, beds were listed as specific bequests. A feather bed with blue hangings or a great bed of walnut might be gifted to a daughter upon marriage or left to a favored servant. In some regions, the best bed in the house was even kept as part of a dowry, not to be used but to be shown. The English phrase, the best bed, appears often in medieval legal documents and was immortalized in Shakespeare's will, where he famously left his second best bed to his wife. This wasn't necessarily a slight. The best bed may have been reserved for guests, kept pristine to impress, rather than used for marital sleep. A communal experience, sleeping with others. Solitary sleeping was rare. Most people shared a bed not only with a spouse but often with siblings, servants, or guests. In castles, pages and ladies-in-waiting might sleep at the foot of a noble's bed, ready to serve during the night. In more modest homes, entire families slept together on straw mats or in shared feather beds. Communal sleeping wasn't merely cultural, it was practical. Shared body heat meant better survival through the night, especially during harsh winters. There's even documentation of strangers sharing beds at inns, a custom so common it became the basis for the bed and breakfast model centuries later. In some cultures, sleeping with others extended to animals. Peasants often brought chickens or small livestock indoors during cold months, and pigs were known to snuggle up for warmth in particularly desperate times. Textiles and tactility, a world of layers. Beyond the straw and feather beds, bed coverings varied by geography and class. Northern Europe favored wool, while Mediterranean households often used lighter linens. The thickness and layering of bedclothes were vital. People layered as much on top of them as beneath. Textile scarcity made bedding a precious commodity. In France and England, laws governed who could wear or display certain fabrics. Sumptuary laws prohibited peasants from using silks or dyed linens, reserving such materials for the nobility. Textile maintenance was equally serious. Bedsheets were boiled with ashes, sun-bleached, and repaired regularly. Embroidered linens were scrubbed with urine or fermented soap mixtures. The beds themselves were cleaned with vinegar and sand. In well-off homes, bedding might be beaten outdoors like rugs, hung on hedgerows or railings to air out. Heat management, staying warm without fire. In most castle bedrooms, fireplaces were a luxury. Even where fireplaces existed, they were small, inefficient, and smoky. Fires were often extinguished before sleep to prevent accidents. To compensate, people relied on portable heat. Iron warming pans were filled with embers from the hearth, closed, and run between the sheets to warm them. These pans were often lined with wool or wrapped in cloth to prevent scorching. Foot warmers, wooden boxes lined with coals, were placed at the ends of beds. Hot stones wrapped in cloth or sand-filled pouches were also used. Over time, these evolved into more familiar hot water bottles. And then there were humans. Children were put to bed early, often used by parents and elders as de facto heaters. Dogs and cats weren't just pets, they were warmth companions. It's no coincidence that in particularly frigid weather, one might call it a three-dog night. Nightly rituals, preparing the bed for sleep. Going to bed was a task. In wealthier homes, it required servants. The featherbeds were fluffed, the straw was shaken, and any pests, lice, fleas, or worse, were hunted out with combs or sprigs of herbs. Bed curtains were drawn, and draft blockers, rolled cloths, or pelts were placed against doors and windows. Candles were snuffed carefully, sometimes by extinguishing them in scented wax or pressed ash. The chamber pot was placed within reach. Slippers or wooden clogs were laid beside the bed. People prayed. Every night across Europe, millions of people knelt beside their bedding and recited prayers of protection, in hopes that the night would pass peacefully. The dark was full of unknowns, spiritual and physical, and sleep was not taken lightly. For many, sleep was a vulnerable act. The idea of dying in one's sleep wasn't poetic, it was common. Nightmares were often seen as omens, and sleepwalking or talking might be interpreted as signs of possession or illness. The guest bed and politics of hospitality. The guest bed was often the most prestigious in the household. Reserved for visiting nobles, clergy, or traveling merchants, it was designed to impress. In castles, hosting someone of equal or higher status often meant yielding the lord's own bed. This was no small gesture, it implied complete trust. Beds could contain secret compartments or valuables. Sharing one's bedchamber symbolized alliance, deference, and diplomacy. During wars, exiles, or pilgrimages, nobles carried beds with them. Portable beds were dismantled and carted alongside tents and provisions. These mobile beds included collapsible frames, rolls of linen and wool, and even folding canopy rods. They were laborious to set up but were symbols of identity and luxury. In the shadows, servants, bedchambers, and secrets. The bed was also a site of intrigue. In royal courts, spies and servants gathered intelligence by eavesdropping during bedtime conversations. Some beds had false panels or secret access points. Ladies' maids and valets slept nearby, often in tiny antechambers or even on the floor. Their role included maintaining privacy, but also vigilance. Theft, gossip, and affairs, many secrets were born in the bedroom. In more scandalous cases, bed sharing led to social or political consequences. Bastards were born from shared warmth. Alliances were broken by whispered words between sheets. The bed and the moon, rhythms of rest. Sleep patterns were regulated not just by the sun, but by the moon. A full moon brought more light into rooms, especially those without shutters. People would rise in the middle of the night, stirred by moonlight or cold, and spend hours in semi-wakefulness before returning to sleep. This segmented sleep was normal. It allowed for tending animals, visiting neighbors, or writing letters. Some people even scheduled this time to read scripture or ponder dreams. The passage of the moon was tracked by rural communities and aligned with agricultural rhythms. Beds were moved according to season, closer to the hearth in winter, closer to open air in summer. Straw was swapped more frequently during harvest, and spring was often a season of renewal not just for crops, but for mattresses and linens. Even in drafty towers, cold stone halls, and simple peasant cottages, the act of sleep became a kind of ritual, a shared culture of adaptation and endurance. Each layer of fabric, feather, and straw served not only to keep people warm, but to weave together the quiet fabric of society. But despite all this effort, what happened when those carefully constructed layers failed? What of the pests, the collapses, the inevitable decay? When the warmth faded and the straw grew thin, how did medieval people confront the darker side of their beds, the discomforts and dangers hidden just beneath the linen? You fluffed the feather bed, drawn the woolen curtains around the canopy, slipped into your linen nightshirt, and even warmed the sheets with a pan of glowing coals. Still, as you settle under layers of fur and wool, you are not alone. The bed, despite all its soft layers and seeming comfort, is a microcosm of medieval life. Teeming with life, to be more exact. In this final section of Story 1, we dive beneath the coverlets to confront the less romantic truths of medieval sleep, the ever-present pests, the challenges of hygiene, and the ingenious if imperfect ways people coped with the discomforts of bedtime. The bed bug problem, an ancient plague. Bed bugs are not a modern nuisance. Archaeological records confirm their presence in ancient Rome, and by the medieval period, they were an unwelcome part of every household, noble or not. In the cracks of wooden bed frames, within the folds of feather ticks, and deep in the stuffing of straw mattresses, these tiny parasites thrived. They were notoriously hard to detect during the day but active and biting by night. Their bites left welts and irritation, and though they weren't known to spread disease, they disrupted sleep and peace of mind alike. Common advice for dealing with bed bugs ranged from the practical to the superstitious. Beds were moved away from walls, legs were smeared with grease or soot to block crawling insects, and herbal bundles, particularly tansy, wormwood, and pennyroyal, were stuffed between mattress layers. In severe cases, straw mattresses were burned and replaced. Featherbeds, being valuable, were beaten, aired, and sometimes baked near ovens to kill infestations. Linen sheets were scrubbed in urine or lye to remove egg clusters. Yet, bed bugs remained stubborn companions to even the most diligent sleepers. Mice and rats, night visitors of the castle. Castles may appear imposing from the outside, but their interiors were often more porous than protective, especially when it came to rodents. The combination of straw, food scraps, and warm corners made beds a haven for mice and rats. Though canopies offered some protection, many people slept with one eye open or a cat nearby. Cats were valued as practical vermin hunters, especially in sleeping quarters. To combat rodent intrusion, some households employed primitive traps, while others relied on repellent herbs mint, lavender, or rue. In monasteries and abbeys, regulations specified bed maintenance not only for health but to prevent infestation, emphasizing a surprising early awareness of hygiene in communal dormitories. Lice, fleas, and the itch of the ages. Fleas and lice were perhaps the most unavoidable pests. They lived not only in bedding but on people, clothing, and pets. Hair was rarely washed, and linens were washed only occasionally, particularly in poorer households. As a result, lice flourished. Fleas were spread by both humans and animals, and their bites were often confused with those of bed bugs. Knit combs, fine-toothed combs, were standard possessions. These small tools, often carved from bone or wood, were used to scrape lice from hair and bedding. They were part of the nightly routine, especially for children. In noble households, laundering became a point of pride. Linens were boiled in copper cauldrons with ash and herbs, aired on sunny hedges, and beaten to drive out insects. Still, no amount of care could ensure a flea-free sleep. Some nobles even wore flea traps, tiny cloth packets filled with blood or honey to lure insects away from the body. Maintenance and repairs, the sleeping year. Beds required constant attention. By midwinter, straw mattresses had collapsed into lumpy, uneven patches. Feathers compacted and shifted, leaving cold pockets. Ropes sagged, creaked, or snapped. Wooden frames grew loose or infested with mites. Spring brought renewal not just to fields but to bedding. The changing of the bed was a semi-annual ritual in most homes. Straw ticks were emptied and restuffed with fresh straw, hay, or reeds. Feathers were shaken and redistributed. In noble homes, entire bedding sets were rotated or replaced. Ropes were tightened, and frames were inspected for damage. Textiles, especially in noble households, were stored in linen chests with fragrant herbs to ward off moths and mold. The linen chest, often locked, was one of the most valuable furnishings in a household. Sleep disorders and superstition. Beyond physical discomfort, medieval sleep was haunted by its own psychology. Sleepwalking was recorded in monastic texts as a condition of spiritual imbalance. Nightmares were feared as demonic visions. The succubus, a female demon believed to assault men in their sleep, and its male counterpart, the incubus, were blamed for night terrors and unexplained exhaustion. Nightmares were also believed to result from poor sleep hygiene, overheating, improper bedding, or sleeping in certain positions. Physicians prescribed dietary changes, bed angle adjustments, or fumigation of rooms with rosemary smoke. There was also a belief in sleeping with your mouth open as a risk. It was thought that evil spirits or even disease could enter through the mouth during sleep. Some people tied cloths loosely around their jaws or slept on their sides to prevent this. Religious comforts and sleeping saints. For many, sleep was made bearable not just by warmth but by faith. Holy medals, carved wooden saints, or embroidered crosses were placed beneath pillows. Bed curtains might be stitched with religious symbols or prayers. Some devout households kept a small crucifix affixed to the canopy above the bed, visible as the last thing seen before closing one's eyes. Sleep was viewed as a rehearsal for death, and rising each morning was cause for gratitude. Prayers before bed were standard, including invocations to Saint Michael or Saint Benedict, patrons against evil dreams. In monastic communities, nighttime sleep was interrupted by Matins early morning prayers that reinforced a life structured by devotion. Sleep here was not an indulgence, but a necessity permitted only in moderation. When beds travel, portability and hardship. Not all beds were stationary. Traveling nobles, soldiers, and merchants often brought bedding with them. Rolls of linen, straw sacks, and collapsible wooden frames were packed on carts. These camp beds were crude but preferable to sleeping on the ground. In inns, bedding was rented and reused. It was common for one night's sleep to involve bedding that had recently cradled someone else. The phrase "changing the bed" referred less to replacing the mattress and more to beating it, brushing it off, and airing it briefly. Even among the wealthy, travel posed dangers. Cold drafts in unfamiliar castles, infested beds at roadside lodgings, or nights spent in tents could undermine health and morale. Portable feather beds, for those who could afford them, became status symbols of comfort on the move. Lessons in endurance, sleeping through history. By modern standards, medieval sleep was rough, but it was also adaptive. People learned to coexist with discomfort. They layered not just blankets, but expectations. A good night's sleep wasn't about luxury, it was about surviving the cold, avoiding pests, and waking up able to work another day. These sleeping arrangements, though crude, were innovative. They tell us about a people deeply attuned to their environment, constrained by limited resources but still striving for comfort. The layering of straw and feather, wool and fur, prayers and herbal bundles shows how culture and necessity met beneath the covers. Today, we might romanticize the canopy beds and stone castles, but to live and sleep there required constant work. It was not the cold alone that challenged rest, but the fragile barrier between human bodies and the world around them. And so we return to the quiet stone room, the hearth long since gone cold, the rushes underfoot brittle with age. The bed, part sanctuary, part battlefield, holds its secrets in layers of straw, feathers, linen, and memory. What does this tell us about comfort, survival, and the hidden rituals that shaped how entire generations drifted into sleep? Story 2. Rushes, Reeds, and Rodents, flooring choices that shaped nightly comfort. You've made your way into a medieval chamber, perhaps a lord's sleeping quarters or a modest peasant cottage. You glance down. It is not the floor you might expect. No polished hardwood, no stone tiles visible. Instead, you're met with a coarse, straw-like layer, irregular, trodden and fragrant with the mixed scents of dried herbs, age-old dust, and maybe something less pleasant. This is not filth. This is intentional. This is a rush-covered floor, and it was a defining feature of medieval sleeping environments across Europe. In this section, we step away from beds and turn our gaze downwards to the surfaces beneath them. These simple materials, rushes, reeds, herbs, and grasses, formed a critical component of domestic life, influencing sleep, comfort, hygiene, and even status. What were rushes? Rushes were a type of plant that grew in wetlands and along riverbanks, Juncus species, to be precise. Flexible, absorbent, and resilient, they were harvested seasonally and dried for use in homes. In some regions, sedges or marsh grasses were substituted, depending on local geography. Why cover the floor in rushes? Simple, stone floors were brutally cold and damp. Wood was rare and expensive. Rushes offered insulation, some cushioning, and a primitive form of cleanliness. They could be swept up and replaced, forming an early approximation of wall-to-wall carpet. Yet these rushes were more than utilitarian. They had ceremonial, social, and symbolic uses as well. The cold realities of medieval flooring. The floors of castles and houses were usually stone slabs, beaten earth, or rough wood planks. Even in upper-class homes, stone predominated. It was durable, fire-resistant, and cheap relative to luxury timber. But stone was unforgiving. In winter, it was icy cold. In summer, it retained dampness. Moisture from the ground seeped through stone or earth floors, contributing to a general sense of chill, even in enclosed rooms. If a bed lacked proper insulation underneath, that cold rose directly up into the straw mattress. Rushes, therefore, served as a buffer. Spread across the entire floor or in specific areas beneath the bed, in front of the hearth, or around seating, they provided a layer of separation between bare feet and the biting chill of stone. How rushes were collected and laid. Rush gathering was often a community affair. In late summer, local laborers harvested rushes from riverbanks. The plants were cut, dried in the sun, and sometimes bundled into mats. For finer uses, only the peeled piths were used, white, soft, and absorbent. These were sometimes twisted into cords or woven into mats called rush matting, a precursor to carpeting. Laying rushes was an intentional process. Floors were swept though not scrubbed, and a fresh layer of rushes was spread, sometimes several inches deep. In finer homes, the rushes might be scented with dried herbs, lavender, rosemary, mint, meadowsweet, or chamomile. These added pleasant smells but also deterred pests and masked more persistent odors. In large households or ecclesiastical buildings, rush laying became a scheduled task. Some manor records from England in the 14th and 15th centuries include accounts for rushes, with separate entries for their cutting, transport, and distribution. The downside: dirt beneath the fragrance. Beneath the surface of these soft-smelling rushes was something far less charming: dirt, waste, insects, and vermin. Though rushes were changed periodically annually in some homes, monthly in others they were not swept up daily. In fact, many households layered new rushes on top of the old. The result was a slow accumulation of organic matter: dropped food, slewed skin, spilt drink, animal droppings, and insects all found a place within the matting. The 16th century Dutch humanist Desiderius Erasmus criticized English rush floors for their filth, noting that people often forgot to remove the old rushes, leading to a breeding ground for vermin and disease. His complaint was less about rushes themselves and more about how they were managed. But despite this, the rushes endured. They were the best affordable option for both peasant cottages and noble halls. Rodents and rushes, a coexistent problem. With warmth and food bits nestled between layers, it's no surprise that rats and mice thrived beneath rush-covered floors. The sound of scurrying at night was a common lullaby. Castles often kept cats in sleeping quarters for this exact reason, not as pets, but as pest control. For many, this was simply part of life. In peasant homes, floors were often made of beaten earth, which compounded the problem. Moisture from outside and the warmth of the hearth created an ideal habitat for rodents and insects. Some homes tried to deter infestations with bundles of herbs tied at the corners of rooms or tucked into the rushes. Others placed flat stones around food areas or bed frames to prevent entry points. Still, most simply accepted that the occasional mouse would scamper across the floor or even into bed. Rushes in churches and ceremonial use. Rushes weren't limited to the home. In medieval churches across Britain, the annual rush-bearing festival involved parishioners gathering and spreading fresh rushes on the floor of the local church. This was both a cleaning ritual and a celebration, often accompanied by music, banners, and processions. Churches had stone floors like castles, and just as cold. Congregants might spend hours kneeling or sitting through services. Rushes made the space more comfortable and inviting, and once again absorbed moisture, candle drips, and dirt. Though most churches eventually moved to tiled or wooden flooring, the tradition persisted in rural areas well into the 19th century. Scent and sound, sensory life on a rush-covered floor. To modern minds, rush floors might seem primitive, even filthy, but they were full of sensory experience. Walking across rushes produced a soft rustling sound, a constant whisper underfoot. Combined with the crackle of a hearth and the occasional creak of timber, this formed the ambient soundtrack of medieval life. The smell was equally important. Though they masked some odors, rushes couldn't eliminate the broader scent of medieval dwellings: smoke, sweat, cooked meat, and chamber pots. The dried herbs often chosen for strength weren't purely decorative. They were survival tools in a world without air fresheners or regular baths. In noble households, the choice of herbs carried symbolic weight. Lavender suggested cleanliness, rosemary, remembrance, chamomile, rest. Some households even had signature scent blends laid into their rushes, meant to make an impression on guests. The space around the bed, framing comfort. Beds didn't float in empty space. They were placed with care near hearths, away from doors, often with a canopy to block drafts. The floor beneath and around the bed was prepared as carefully as the bed itself. In winter, thicker rushes were laid beneath beds to provide insulation. In some regions, woven mats were added underneath, creating a double barrier. The richer the household, the more layered the approach. For those unable to afford a raised bed, the floor itself was the sleeping surface. Straw or hay was laid atop the rushes, then covered with a blanket or cloak. Even in these cases, people placed emphasis on the area beneath them. No one wanted to sleep directly on damp earth or bare stone. The floor, in other words, shaped the bed. Cleaning rituals and seasonal rhythms. Cleaning rush floors was not a daily task, but a seasonal one. Entire households might be involved in clearing the old rushes, beating the mats, and relaying fresh bundles. This work often occurred in spring or before holidays. For peasant homes, it aligned with planting seasons. For castles, it coincided with feasts or the arrival of noble guests. Records from 14th century English manors mention servants being paid extra to clear rushes and scrub floors. Even then, people recognized that rushes could harbor illness if left unchanged for too long. Interestingly, some households placed boards or rugs on top of rushes in high-traffic areas to prolong their cleanliness. These makeshift floor mats mark the beginning of our modern understanding of layered flooring. A medieval home was not defined solely by its walls or roof, but by what lay beneath your feet. Rushes, humble and often overlooked, formed the literal groundwork of rest, work, and survival. They cushioned dreams and silenced footsteps. They welcomed guests and absorbed the noise of everyday life. And they shaped how and where people found warmth and comfort each night. But how did these rush-covered floors evolve? What happened when better materials, like wooden planks and tile, became more accessible? And how did this transition shape the future of sleep itself? If you lived in a medieval household, your feet would be intimately acquainted with the floor. Whether straw-covered or earthen, cold and uneven, it was the one surface you constantly touched. But as time wore on and societies evolved, so too did the floors beneath people's beds and bodies. In this section, we trace the shift from plant-covered floors to permanent wooden planks and tiles, and how that seemingly mundane transformation shaped where and how people slept, worked, and lived. The rise of the wooden floor. For centuries, wood was a luxury in large-scale construction. In castles and manor houses, stone was preferred for strength and fire resistance, and in peasant homes, timber was reserved for frames and beams, not for floors. But by the late medieval period, roughly the 14th to 16th centuries, something began to change. Deforestation in certain areas gave way to managed woodlots. Timber framing evolved, and carpentry guilds expanded in urban areas. Slowly, Planked floors began appearing first in upper rooms of castles and manor houses, then in middle-class urban dwellings. Wooden floors didn't entirely replace rushes. Instead, they coexisted for a time. Boards might be laid across joists, but rushes were still spread on top to absorb dirt and insulate against cold. However, once true floorboards were in place, they offered something rushes couldn't: a surface that could be cleaned, polished, and eventually decorated. This changed the entire texture of domestic space. Hygiene evolves, the first steps toward cleanable surfaces. A wooden floor could be swept. It could be wiped, oiled, or scrubbed. This seems obvious now, but at the time it marked a small revolution. Unlike rush-covered floors, which accumulated waste invisibly, wooden planks made dirt visible. Dust, crumbs, and rodent droppings no longer disappeared into the underlayer. They had to be dealt with. This encouraged sweeping, which in turn encouraged tools, brooms, cloths, and even early mops. Households began to take pride in their floor cleanliness. Visitors might note polished wood, not fragrant rushes. Floorboards could be sanded or planed smooth. Some were treated with linseed oil, which darkened the wood and made it more resistant to moisture. Others were covered with textiles, animal hides, or coarse woven rugs. Suddenly, the relationship between bed and floor shifted. No longer resting on a fragrant, disposable underlayer, beds now stood on cleaner, more permanent foundations. And with that came expectations about the space around sleep. Changing aesthetics, from practical to decorative. With permanent flooring came the opportunity to decorate. Medieval and early modern homes weren't as plain as we often think. Colors, tapestries, and ornamentation were deeply valued, and floors eventually joined this culture of display. In the wealthiest homes, floors were painted with patterns, sometimes simple checkerboards, other times elaborate floral motifs. This practice, more common in Tudor England and Renaissance Italy, turned the floor into a kind of horizontal wall, a site of symbolism and taste. Tiles, too, emerged as decorative elements. Glazed clay tiles were used in churches and palaces across Spain and Italy. In France and England, encaustic tiles, inlaid with colored clays, decorated floors in abbeys and castles. These weren't widespread, but their presence suggested refinement. Even in more modest homes, decoration mattered. Painted floorboards, woven mats, or stitched carpets signaled that the householder cared about appearances, and by extension, about moral discipline and order. Rural resistance, why rushes lingered. Despite advances in flooring, rushes didn't disappear overnight. In fact, in rural England and much of northern Europe, rush-covered floors remained common well into the 17th century. Why? Because they were still practical, especially in areas where resources were scarce. For peasant households with packed earth floors, rushes were an affordable solution. For those in timbered cottages with cold drafts, a thick layer of rushes remained the best insulation. And in households where animals shared the indoor space, disposable floor coverings helped manage the mess. There was also cultural inertia. Rushes had been used for centuries. They were a known technology, embedded in seasonal rituals, local economies, and even religious festivals. In some ways, they persisted because they were part of life's rhythm. It was not unusual for a peasant family in 1500 to sleep on a rush-covered floor, while a merchant's wife in London was sweeping oak floorboards upstairs in a townhome. Geography, wealth, and custom all played a role. Beds and the new floor, repositioning the furniture. With the shift to permanent flooring came a new arrangement of furniture. In rush-covered rooms, beds had to be positioned carefully to avoid drafts, damp, or vermin beneath. But wooden floors changed those calculations. Beds could now be moved more freely. Carpets or mats could be placed beneath them for added comfort. Bed legs could be equipped with pads or decorative feet. In some homes, platforms were created to raise beds even further from the floor, enhancing their presence in the room. Bed rugs, thick woven coverings placed at the side of the bed, added tactile warmth and allowed sleepers to step out of bed without touching cold boards. This also marked a shift in how bedrooms were understood. Rather than purely utilitarian spaces for warmth and sleep, they became areas for display. Polished floors, orderly furnishings, and clean linens all contributed to a new ideal of domestic refinement. Rodent control and floorboards, mixed results. One might assume that solid wooden floors reduced rodent problems, but the story is more complex. While fewer crumbs disappeared into rush layers, floorboards introduced their own challenges. Gaps between planks or hollow spaces beneath them became nesting areas for mice and rats. Servants reported scratching beneath the floor, and in some buildings, poison or traps were placed under the boards. Nevertheless, having a visible floor allowed for better detection. Rodent droppings were no longer hidden. Infestations could be addressed, rather than merely endured. The shift in flooring thus aligned with a broader cultural shift toward domestic hygiene and surveillance of the home environment. Construction and class, who got what kind of floor? In general, the quality of flooring tracked closely with class. Peasant homes, beaten earth remained the norm. Some improved their flooring with layers of lime or ash for dryness. Rushes were universal, replaced only when they became too decayed to walk on. Craftsmen and merchants. As urban centers grew, so did demand for timber. Multi-story homes often had planked floors in the upper levels, especially bedrooms. These were oiled or painted, sometimes partially carpeted. Nobles and clergy. Floors were symbols of taste and power. Upper halls had wide oak or elm planks, sometimes painted. Bedchambers were treated with extra care, polished boards, rugs from the east, and hearths with stone surrounds. Monasteries. Monks often slept in communal dormitories with wooden floors. In Cistercian abbeys, stone was preferred for austerity. Still, even here, rushes were used as a spiritual compromise, humble, biodegradable, and symbolic of the transience of the body. Regional variations and climate considerations. Geography played a critical role in flooring materials. In Mediterranean regions, where stone and tile were abundant and winters milder, rushes never took hold in the same way. Floors were tiled or mosaic paved, with wool rugs used in colder seasons. Raised wooden floors were rare. In northern Europe, where the ground froze deeply and rushes grew in abundance, layered plant matter remained dominant for longer. Scandinavian households used pine shavings or mosses in place of rushes. In parts of Ireland, dried peat moss was used to warm the floor under beds. These regional traditions persisted even as trade expanded. Cultural preference, local materials, and seasonal rhythms ensured that the world beneath one's bed was never a universal story. From the ground up, the floor as a mirror of change. The evolution from rush-covered floors to planked and tiled ones did more than improve hygiene or appearance. It reshaped how people thought about their homes. The very act of being able to clean one's floor changed domestic behavior. It introduced routine. It created standards. It supported the rise of furniture like footstools, chairs, and rugs, which in turn encouraged a different posture of daily life. The sleeping environment became cleaner, more private, more organized, less focused on survival, more on comfort and control. Beds, once set into straw-covered corners, now occupied proud spaces in warm, wooden-floored chambers. But the journey wasn't complete. What happened when the cold came from below, even through floorboards? How did people in grand stone castles or timber-framed cottages adapt their flooring to resist winter's bite? It's midnight in a medieval castle. The fire in the hearth has faded to a glow. The wind moans beyond the walls, and the chill rises not from above, but from below. The stone floor beneath the bed is cold, colder than the outside air, and it radiates upward, through bedding, through straw, through wood. The night is long, and without insulation underfoot, even the thickest woolen blankets are no match for the biting cold. We explore the problem of ground cold, a silent but relentless adversary to medieval comfort, and the adaptations made to floors, beds, and sleeping spaces in response to it. From clever layering and insulation methods to architectural design choices, this chapter examines how humanity confronted one of the most overlooked threats to restful sleep. The physics of the chill. Cold air settles low. In buildings with high ceilings like many medieval castles, the upper layers retained some warmth while the floor level remained frigid. Add to this the thermal conductivity of stone, and it becomes clear why sleeping on or near the ground posed serious challenges. Even in homes with wooden floorboards, gaps between planks allowed drafts to rise. In cottages with dirt floors, winter moisture crept upward, turning hard-packed earth into a sponge for cold. For those sleeping without a proper bed, warmth was always under siege. People understood this. While they didn't have thermometers or a vocabulary of thermal insulation, they had generations of practical knowledge. They knew where to sleep, what to layer, and how to combat the cold creeping from the floor. The strategic positioning of beds. One of the first solutions was spatial. Beds were rarely placed directly on open stone. Instead, they were raised not just for social symbolism, but for survival. A raised bed avoided cold floors, rodents, and moisture. Even the lowest class of bedding, hay or straw on a blanket, was ideally placed near a hearth or on a dry, elevated portion of the room. In wealthier homes, beds were often positioned near interior walls, away from exterior drafts. Where possible, the bedchamber was located above a room with a fire, taking advantage of rising heat. In peasant cottages, sleeping lofts were added under the roof, away from the cold floor entirely. Sleeping off the ground was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Floor coverings as insulators. While rushes were the most common floor covering, their primary value in winter was insulation. Laid thickly enough, dried rushes acted like carpet padding, trapping warm air and softening the hard chill of stone or earth. In wealthier homes, rushes were supplemented with rugs, animal skins, or woven mats made of wool or coarse flax. In some northern regions, families placed peat moss, pine needles, or even dry leaves beneath rushes for added warmth. These natural materials created layers, one for comfort, one for warmth, one to catch dirt. Textile mats became more common over time, though they were costly. In warmer climates, mats were thinner but still necessary in winter, and all were vulnerable to the same problem: rot, pests, and the eventual need for replacement. Wool rugs and animal hides. Wool was the medieval miracle fabric, warm, water-resistant, and available in abundance. It was also a major export and the foundation of the English economy by the 14th century. Woolen rugs, often coarsely woven, were used near beds and hearths. In wealthier homes, these rugs were dyed or embroidered. In poorer homes, they might be made from scraps or old clothing, repurposed into patches and braided mats. Animal hides served a dual function. Laid on the floor, they provided warmth and softness. When not in use, they could be lifted and shaken. Fur-on hides were especially prized: fox, bear, or wolf, depending on the region. In remote northern areas, seal skin was also used. The placement of hides beneath the bed area created a kind of personal heat zone. Though primitive by modern standards, these layers made a noticeable difference on a sub-zero night. Hearths, underfloor fires, and bed proximity. The hearth was the heart of the medieval home, and sleep often revolved around it. Peasants slept as close to the fire as space and safety allowed. In cottages, beds might be within a few feet of the hearth, with a low wall or screen to block sparks. In castles, the great hall's fire provided ambient heat, but sleeping chambers often had smaller hearths of their own. Some architectural innovations. aimed to make floors warmer by design. In Roman times, hypocausts underfloor heating systems were used in bathhouses and villas. These involved hot air circulating beneath raised stone floors. Though this knowledge largely disappeared in the early Middle Ages, similar ideas returned during the Renaissance. By the 13th century, castle designers were experimenting with fireplaces built into stone walls and vents that allowed some heat to rise between floors. In Scandinavian countries, stone stoves and enclosed hearths retained heat longer and made floor-level warmth more feasible. Still, such methods were rare. For most people, the solution was proximity sleep as close to the fire as you could, and rely on layering for everything else. Sleeping with animals. In many peasant homes, warmth came in the form of livestock. Barn animals were often brought indoors in winter not just for their safety, but for the heat they radiated. Goats, pigs, and chickens might sleep on one side of the room, separated by a low barrier from the human sleeping space. The floor warmed slightly from their presence, and the air inside remained a few degrees higher than outside. Even in urban homes, dogs and cats shared bedding. While this might strike us today as unhygienic, it was entirely practical. A dog sleeping on your feet was more than companionship, it was central heating. Some medieval texts even describe bed sharing with calves or lambs on exceptionally cold nights. It wasn't romantic, it was survival. Floor layers and seasonal swapping. Floor insulation wasn't static. Households added layers as winter approached. In autumn, rushes were replaced or doubled. Extra mats or skins were laid near beds. If the family could afford it, heavy curtains were hung over doorways and windows to trap warm air near the ground. In spring, these layers were removed, cleaned, or burned. This was a necessary rhythm preventing mold and controlling pests, but also marking the shift of seasons. It was part of the medieval understanding of home care, tied not to calendar dates but to sensation. When the floor felt warm underfoot, winter had truly passed. Architectural adaptations, raised floors and internal chambers. Some homes went beyond insulation. In colder regions, builders developed double floors, a wooden subfloor built over the stone base, creating a dead air space that insulated against ground chill. While not widespread, this technique appears in later medieval manors and urban homes. In larger buildings, inner chambers or solar rooms were developed specifically for sleeping. Located on upper floors and often above kitchens or pantries, these rooms benefited from residual heat. Thick tapestries and internal shutters retained warmth. Floors were laid with boards or tiles, then covered with rugs or rushes. This layering, both architectural and material, shows how seriously people took the challenge of ground cold. It was a force they couldn't see, but one they learned to resist with great creativity. Cold wisdom, knowledge passed down through generations. Perhaps the most fascinating part of medieval floor insulation was not what people built, but what they remembered. Children were taught to sleep with socks on, even under 3 blankets. Grandmothers knew how many rushes made for a warm corner. Fathers passed down how to spot frost rising through floorboards before it soaked the straw. Entire generations grew up not fearing cold, but knowing how to live with it. Their adaptations, born of scarcity, patience, and ingenuity, laid the groundwork for future comfort. We often think of progress as technology, but sometimes it's knowing where to put your bed so the frost doesn't wake you. The floor beneath your bed might seem like the least important part of the sleeping experience, but in the medieval world, it was the front line in the war against the cold. Every rush, every skin, every polished plank was part of a centuries-long campaign for comfort. And as floor coverings improved and heating evolved, the bed itself was poised for its next great transformation from a shared, functional space into something private, personal, and deeply psychological. But when did sleep become about solitude? When did comfort stop being a communal act and become an individual pursuit? Story 3. The nightcap and other forgotten garments of medieval bedtime. The hearth glows faintly. The bed, layered with straw tick, feather mattress, and wool blankets, is finally ready. Outside, the wind scrapes against the castle wall or cottage window. The night is cold, bitterly so. But before slipping beneath the covers, there's one last task: dressing for bed. In our modern world, sleepwear is often optional, comfortable, and largely standardized. But in the medieval period, sleeping garments were highly strategic, deeply tied to class, climate, and custom. In this section, we unravel the layers of clothing worn to bed in the Middle Ages, starting with the humble but iconic nightcap, and explore how people dressed not for vanity, but for survival. The nightcap, function before fashion. Let's begin at the top, literally. The nightcap, or sleeping cap, is now little more than a cartoonish symbol. Today, it's associated with storybooks, Ebenezer Scrooge, or novelty sleepwear. But in the Middle Ages, it was essential. It wasn't worn for style. It was worn because your head was cold. Without central heating, even wealthy castles could be freezing by nightfall. The body's core could be wrapped in wool and fur, but the head remained exposed, especially when sleeping under high canopies or near drafty stone walls. The solution: a soft cap, usually made of linen or wool, often tied or fitted close to the skull. For men, this was often a simple coif, shaped like a tight hood. For women, it might be a linen veil or drawstring bonnet, layered over braids or pinned hair. These caps trapped warmth, prevented heat loss through the scalp, and even helped keep lice or fleas from crawling in during the night. They also kept hair clean, essential when bathing was infrequent. Underwear as outerwear, the dual use of undergarments. The idea of separate pajamas hadn't fully emerged in the medieval world. Instead, people often slept in their underclothes, and in many cases, those doubled as everyday garments. For men, this meant a linen or woolen shirt, called a chemise or smock, and braies, loose-fitting trousers that tied at the waist and thigh. These were breathable and easy to move in. For women, sleepwear typically consisted of a long linen shift, often worn under gowns during the day. These shifts were loose, long-sleeved, and could reach the ankles. On cold nights, they might layer a second shift or pull on a mantle or cloak over it. In wealthier households, designated night shifts, or bed robes made of finer linen, were used, sometimes embroidered subtly around the collar or hem. But for most, sleepwear was whatever clean underlayer they had. Notably, linen was preferred over wool for direct skin contact. It breathed better, absorbed sweat, and helped reduce rashes or skin irritations, essential in an age before soaps were standardized. Wool socks in cold floors. The next concern was the feet. Cold floors were infamous. Even with rushes, rugs, or wooden boards, walking barefoot at night was a shock to the system. Thus, socks were worn to bed, especially in winter. Simple woolen hose or knit socks, often made from homespun wool, were pulled up under the shift or shirt. In colder climates, some wore layered socks or wrapped feet in cloth strips, tied with cord. These were removed only when fully tucked in bed. In wealthier homes, fur-lined slippers might be used to walk to bed. In monastic settings, sleeping barefoot was sometimes considered virtuous, but even monks occasionally made exceptions in winter. Gloves and hand wraps. Though less commonly depicted, sleeping gloves or hand wrappings were sometimes used in extreme cold. Woolen mittens, or simply strips of cloth tied around the hands, were not uncommon in northern regions or stone castles. For laborers and peasants, calloused hands might crack from cold or dryness. Wrapping them not only retained warmth but also protected skin. In some folk traditions, herbal salves were applied at night and wrapped under cloth, a medieval form of hand cream. Outer layers, cloaks, robes, and mantles. Nightwear didn't stop at underlayers. Robes, Cloaks and mantles, normally daytime outerwear, were often repurposed at night, especially by those too poor to own a second set of warm clothing. A peasant might wrap themselves in their work cloak, worn all day and kept near the hearth. A merchant might own a bed robe, lined with fur or thick wool, worn only in the evenings. In noble households, a bed gown was a common item, a heavy, often floor-length robe used for nighttime routines, prayer, bathing, or late-night reading. Children were wrapped in blankets or cloaks, often sharing them with siblings. Bobbies might be tightly swaddled, not only for comfort but to retain warmth in drafty spaces. Bedtime routines and dressing for the night. Clothing was only part of the process. The medieval bedtime routine, while simple, was deeply ritualized. In monastic settings, monks removed their outer robes, washed their hands and faces in cold water, and retired in linen shifts to unheated dormitories. In peasant homes, clothes were folded or not before bed. In noble homes, servants assisted with undressing, brushing hair, and preparing bed garments. Sleepwear had to strike a balance: warmth, modesty, and functionality. Modesty was especially emphasized in religious households or among unmarried individuals. Shared sleeping quarters were common, and being improperly dressed was both a practical and moral concern. Some monasteries even had rules about how much skin could be visible during sleep. Laundering and bedclothes maintenance. Unlike modern pajamas, medieval sleepwear wasn't washed after every use. Water was scarce, soap was handmade, and laundry was labor-intensive. Linen shifts were boiled periodically with ash or lye. Wool garments were aired or brushed, not washed. Nightcaps might be rinsed more often, especially if hair oil or lice were a concern. Servants in noble homes often tended to this laundering, and records from manorial estates show frequent purchases of lye soap, ash, and bleaching cloths for this purpose. The smell of clean linen, a rare thing, was deeply prized. This slow, seasonal rhythm of washing meant that sleeping garments were valued possessions, often patched, repaired, and passed down within families. Class, gender, and sleepwear variations. Just as with everything else in medieval life, class and gender shaped how people dressed for bed. A noblewoman might retire in an embroidered nightshift, draped in velvet or lined with rabbit fur. A peasant girl might sleep in the same smock she wore to milk goats that morning. Men of rank often had sleeping tunics, lighter than daytime attire but heavier than a shift. Kings and lords were sometimes buried in these soft robes meant for final rest. Clergy slept modestly, fully covered in loose shifts, with sometimes a belt tied to prevent improper thoughts or movement. Monks, especially in the stricter orders, were discouraged from removing too many layers, both to discourage vanity and to harden the body against comfort. Dressing for the unexpected night. It's worth noting that night didn't always mean rest. A knock at the door, a fire, a child's cough, the call to prayer. Emergencies were common, and one had to be dressed enough to respond. Thus, sleepwear was never too revealing nor too loose. It had to allow movement, retain heat, and maintain dignity. A man might leap from bed and don boots within moments. A woman might wrap herself in a cloak before answering a call. Even the nightcap, tied snugly, ensured that hair wouldn't fall wild and unkempt before strangers. The medieval bedchamber was more than a place of rest. It was a carefully negotiated space where warmth, modesty, and function came together each night. And what people wore to sleep mattered not for style, but for survival. But how did these garments evolve? When did sleepwear become a distinct category of clothing, separate from undergarments? And how did new materials like cotton and silk change the bedtime experience across centuries? The flickering candle dims as you pull your linen shift down to your ankles and tie your nightcap firmly beneath your chin. It's a ritual you've performed for years, but outside your door, the world is changing. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the idea of what one wore to sleep began to shift quietly but significantly. Materials changed, social norms changed, and the night, once ruled by necessity and improvisation, became a space for deliberate comfort, even subtle elegance. In this second section, we'll explore how sleepwear evolved from practical underclothing to its own category of attire. We'll follow the introduction of cotton and silk, the rise of dressing gowns, and how sleepwear subtly reflected broader cultural changes from trade and fashion to gender and morality. The persistent dominance of linen. For much of the medieval period, linen remained the king of sleepwear. Woven from the flax plant, linen was breathable, durable, and relatively smooth against the skin. Though labor-intensive to produce, it was the most common fabric for underclothes, including shifts, smocks, and nightshirts. A good set of linen garments could last years patched and repaired again and again. Its breathability made it ideal for direct contact with the skin. Wool might be warmer, but linen didn't itch. It also wicked away sweat essential when bathing was infrequent. In fact, many people wore linen layers to keep their outer garments clean, not themselves. As nightwear, linen shifts were simply extensions of day underclothes. They were long, loose, and worn by all genders. The wealthier you were, the finer your linen, smoothly woven, bleached white, sometimes embroidered with initials or religious motifs at the collar. Still, for most people, linen remained a functional choice, not a fashionable one. That would begin to change. The arrival of cotton, a textile shift. By the 14th and 15th centuries, cotton began to make its way into European markets, first in small amounts, then more steadily through Mediterranean trade. Though less luxurious than silk and less durable than wool, cotton had unique properties. It was softer, more insulating than linen, and easier to dye. In sleepwear, it marked a turning point. Cotton nightshirts appeared in elite households by the late 15th century. In Italy and Spain, merchants imported Indian cottons, often printed or painted with floral designs. These were still rare and expensive, but their softness made them a coveted item for intimate garments, including bedclothes. By the early modern period, particularly in urban centers like London, Amsterdam, and Venice, cotton began to supplement or replace linen as the material of choice for nightwear, especially for women and children. The Industrial Revolution of textiles was still centuries away, but the seeds were being sown. Sleepwear, once humble and utilitarian, began to soften, literally and socially. Silk for sleep, from trade routes to bedrooms. If cotton was a quiet revolution, silk was a luxury explosion. Introduced through the Silk Road, and later via Byzantine and Islamic trade networks, silk was known in Europe from at least the 9th century but remained prohibitively expensive for most. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Italy had developed its own silk production centers, notably in Lucca and Venice, making silk more accessible to the upper classes. Silk sleepwear began as night robes or lounging garments for aristocrats. These were often richly dyed deep red, blue, or green and embroidered with metallic thread. They weren't worn under the covers but over linen undergarments during bedtime reading, religious devotions, or quiet evening conversation. Silk became a signal of intimacy. It wasn't shown in public but reserved for private spaces. To be seen in silk at bedtime was to display wealth in its most indulgent form. Men wore silk-lined nightgowns or short robes. Women wore silken nightcaps, sometimes trimmed with lace or pearls. These garments often blurred the lines between sleepwear and luxury. The dressing gown, birth of the transitional garment. As wealth and trade increased in the late medieval and early modern periods, a new category of garment emerged, the dressing gown. Also known as a morning gown, robe de chambre, or house robe, this was a garment worn before and after bed, not necessarily during sleep. It served a practical purpose, providing warmth and modesty when rising from bed, but quickly became a space for aesthetic expression. These gowns were long, often padded, and featured elaborate sleeves or embroidery. In noble homes, they were made from brocade, velvet, or quilted silk. In more modest homes, wool or cotton versions provided comfort without the flash. Importantly, the dressing gown marked a new relationship with privacy. People were beginning to expect a time and space between sleeping and presenting themselves to the world. This garment was also portable. Travelers packed dressing gowns for use at inns or guest chambers, and they were often included in trousseaux for brides. The evolution of the nightcap. As materials evolved, so did the nightcap itself. What began as a simple linen hood or coif expanded into varied forms. Flat caps tied under the chin for snugness. Bonnet-style caps for women, sometimes ruffled or edged in lace. Padded or quilted caps, popular in colder climates. Silken nightcaps, purely decorative in elite circles. By the 16th century, nightcaps were sometimes monogrammed, or adorned with lace, a nod to their personal significance. They were still worn mainly for warmth, but they had entered the world of fashion, however quietly. In some portraits, especially posthumous or private ones, men are shown wearing nightcaps, a symbol of rest, modesty, and piety. Gendered norms and nightwear. Sleepwear also began to reflect and reinforce gender roles. For men, the typical attire was a loose nightshirt, resembling a long tunic, sometimes belted at the waist. In colder seasons, a robe or overshirt was added. Nightcaps were plain and fitted. For women, night shifts became longer, sometimes with more elaborate sleeves or collars. Modesty remained a central concern. Many shifts reached to the floor and covered wrists and neck. Caps became more decorative, and in elite homes, a woman might wear layers of bedclothing, including a robe or wrap made from quilted silk. These differences weren't just practical. They reflected broader societal values: male autonomy, female modesty, and the assumption that women remained on display even in private. The rise of sleep as a private experience. Until the later Middle Ages, privacy was rare. People slept in shared rooms or even shared beds. But as architectural design changed and new materials became available, the concept of private sleep began to emerge. Chambers were divided. Beds had curtains. Dressing gowns and sleepwear allowed individuals to be seen without being seen, dignified, covered, but still at ease. This shift toward privacy changed how and why people dressed for bed. Nightwear no longer served only a physical function. It became psychological, a barrier between the public world and the inner life. And with that came new behaviors: reading in bed, private prayer, even journaling. The clothes one wore in these moments became part of a new rhythm of personal space. Travel, sleep, and portable nightwear. As more people traveled, merchants, clerics, diplomats, the need for portable sleepwear grew. Traveling wardrobes included linen shifts for bed, dressing gowns for privacy in inns, nightcaps for shared quarters, slippers or thin-soled shoes for walking between rooms. Sleeping in unfamiliar beds, often shared or barely insulated, required preparedness. It was common to carry personal linens, especially among the wealthy. Bedclothes were a sign of cleanliness and respectability. By the 16th century, travel chests often included nightwear, sewing kits for repair, and even perfumed sachets to scent bed linen. The seamstress and the sleepwear trade. The evolution of sleepwear also was shaped by the growing profession of seamstresses. Women who sewed shifts, nightcaps, and robes became integral to urban economies. Some sold ready-made garments in markets. Others worked by commission for noble or merchant households. Their work was rarely recorded but crucial. By the late 15th century, seamstresses were regulated in cities like London and Paris. Bedclothes were sometimes included in dowries or wills listed by name. One fine linen nightshift, embroidered with matching coif. Even in the quietest parts of life, someone was sewing, stitching, preparing the garments that shaped sleep. In just a few centuries, nightwear evolved from functional layers of necessity to symbols of personal space, taste, and transition. Linen gave way to cotton, cotton bowed to silk, shifts turned into robes, and sleep, once merely survival, became something more curated and intimate. But what happened when things went wrong? How did people protect their sleepwear from pests, stains, and fire? What does the nighttime wardrobe tell us about anxiety, danger, and vulnerability in the medieval world? The fire in the hearth has died. You're nestled into bed, wrapped in your shift and woolen socks, your nightcap snug on your head. But something's wrong. The embers flare suddenly, a scream echoes from down the hall, or a pounding knock wakes the household. You're not alone. The night, for all its quiet rituals and cozy garments, was never entirely safe. In this final section of Story 3, we explore the fragility of medieval sleepwear not as clothing, but as defense. What happened when the garments meant for comfort failed in the face of fire, flight, illness, or fear? How did people adapt when the security of the night was shattered? Fire in the bedchamber. The most immediate danger to sleeping households was fire. Open flames from hearths, candles, oil lamps, or torches were commonplace in bed hangings. Woolen blankets and linen shifts were highly flammable. Bedchambers, with their canopy beds and rush-covered floors, were fire traps. One tipped candle could engulf a room in seconds. If a coal pan was accidentally left on the featherbed or a curtain brushed, a hearth tragedy could strike while the household slept. Nightwear wasn't flame-resistant. Linen ignited easily, and wool, though more resistant, would smolder, causing severe burns. Records from medieval coroner rolls and town chronicles note frequent deaths from bed fires. Children, left near hearths, were particularly vulnerable. To protect against this, some wealthier homes employed metal fire guards in bedchambers. Iron candle stands away from bedding. Servants to check fires before sleep. Still, the danger remained. This ever-present threat made how one dressed for sleep a practical choice. Clothing had to be warm, yes, but it also needed to be easy to throw off or run in if disaster struck. Flight from the bed, dressing for escape. Medieval nights could be volatile. Raids, sieges, peasant uprisings, or household conflicts might force people to flee their beds in haste. And since most people shared sleeping spaces, often with little privacy, being caught in inappropriate or indecent sleepwear was deeply humiliating. Even in emergencies, modesty mattered. Thus, many people slept in layers that allowed for sudden exposure to others. A belted shift, a readily reachable cloak, or a dressing gown at the bedside were essential, especially for women. Men often kept boots or slippers by the bed, ready to move quickly. In castles, guards and pages sometimes slept fully dressed, ready to respond to threats. In towns, curfews and night watches were common, but no guarantee of peace. Merchants kept travel clothes within reach in case of burglary or fire. Sleepwear was not just about comfort, it was tactical. Illness, night sweats, and bedclothes as indicators of disease. In the medieval world, illness struck fast and often at night. Fevers, plague, consumption, tuberculosis, and sweating sickness all had recognizable nighttime symptoms. Bedclothes, particularly shifts and nightcaps, became evidence of illness long before diagnosis. Night sweats, in particular, were feared. Drenched linen shifts in the morning often signaled something serious. And since bathing was rare, these garments soaked in sweat or bodily fluids became vectors for lice, infection, and even spiritual anxiety. Medical manuals recommended changing shifts frequently, especially for the sick. Herbal sachets were placed in nightcaps. Some physicians advised dressing lightly to allow the body to vent illness. Others said to bundle tightly to draw the fever out. Families passed down these ideas. A woolen shift in winter was healthful. A wet nightcap signaled chills. A shift that clung too tightly was bad for the blood. Sleepwear thus carried not just warmth but omens, nightmares and superstitions of improper sleep attire. Medieval culture was rich in nighttime superstitions. Improper dress was often associated with spiritual vulnerability. The belief that evil spirits could enter the body during sleep was widespread. Some wore cross-shaped amulets sewn into their nightshirts. Others kept a scapular, a religious cloth, around their neck. Nightcaps might be tied with protective knots or stitched with sacred initials. Sleeping without a cap was sometimes said to let demons enter through the head. Sleeping with exposed feet was unlucky. In some parts of France and Italy, women were advised never to sleep with unbound hair, lest spirits twist it or steal it. Children, especially, were dressed carefully. A night shift to cover the chest. Socks to block drafts. Charms sewn into seams. These practices reflect a deeper anxiety, that sleep was a vulnerable state, and clothes were a barrier between the self and the unseen. Death in bed, last garments and burial shifts. Many medieval people died in their sleep. It was considered a blessing if the soul was prepared. The garments worn at death often became burial clothing, especially among the poor. There was no change into fine robes or formal wear. Instead, people were buried in their last clean shift or wrapped in a shroud that mimicked a sleeping garment. In monasteries, monks were often buried in their night habits, simple robes or shifts, a final symbol of humility. Women, particularly widows, were sometimes buried in linen that had been saved for years, specifically for this purpose. Nightwear thus extended into death. It wasn't just for comfort, it was the last identity a person wore. Repurposing, repair, and the invisible labor of sleep. Even when nightwear failed, torn, burned, or stained, it was rarely discarded. Shifts were patched, nightcaps resewn. Families passed garments from child to child, sometimes from servant to master and back. A nightgown might become a rag, then a bandage, then fuel for a fire. Cloth was precious. Every thread mattered. The invisible labor behind sleepwear, seamstresses, washerwomen, menders, rarely appears in records, but their work sustained the bedtime rituals of every household. The same hands that stitched day gowns stitched nightshirts. The same dye pots used for noble tunics were used for bed robes. Even the humble string that tied a coif beneath the chin was the result of hours of work. Nightwear may seem like an afterthought in history, but it was a constant cycle of making, using, breaking, and remaking. The night as a mirror of the day. At its heart, sleepwear in the Middle Ages reveals how people managed vulnerability. Fire could take the bed, but you dressed to run. Illness could strike, but you layered to sweat it out. Spirits might visit, but you wore the right symbols. Poverty pressed in, but you made do with a patched shift. Even in sleep, especially in sleep, people adapted, adjusted, and prepared. They crafted rituals from scraps. They wore dignity into the dark. They met fear with fabric. And through it all, the simple nightcap remained a symbol of warmth, of continuity, of the small human defiance in the face of a cold world. In the end, what we wear to sleep tells us not only how we rest, but how we live and how we fear. So what would your nightwear say about your time, your class, your worries? And how did a simple linen shift come to carry the weight of history? Story 4. Warming pans and foot warmers, heating the bed before central heating. Night falls early in a medieval winter. The hearth burns low, casting flickers across stone walls. The wind howls beyond the arrow slits of the castle or whistles through the wattle and daub of a peasant's home. You've prepared the bedding, bundled into your linen shift, and pulled your cap tight. But one challenge remains. The bed is still cold. In a time before central heating, when even indoor fires couldn't reach every room. Warming the bed was an act of ingenuity, necessity, and daily ritual. In this first section of Story 4, we explore how medieval and early modern people developed tools to warm their sleeping places, from embers in metal pans to beds stuffed with warm stones, and how these practices transformed the experience of going to bed. Why warm the bed? Sleeping in a stone-walled chamber in January was a test of endurance. Even layered with straw ticks, feather beds, wool blankets, and furs, the initial moments under the covers could be painfully cold. Linen sheets, though luxurious, held the chill. Cold feet took a long time to warm naturally. This was not just uncomfortable, it was potentially dangerous. Chill at night was associated with illness. From humoral theory to folk wisdom, it was believed that cold could penetrate the bones, cause fevers, or worsen rheumatism. The idea that a cold bed led to bad health was so widespread that warming beds became a preventative act as much as a comforting one. Hence, a series of solutions emerged, often simple, sometimes clever, designed to make the first moments in bed bearable, and even, on lucky nights, cozy. The warming pan, embers in a lidded bowl. One of the most iconic tools was the bed warming pan. These were shallow metal pans, usually brass or copper, attached to long wooden handles and fitted with hinged lids. They looked like cooking pans, but their purpose was specific: to be filled with glowing embers or hot coals from the hearth, then placed under the bed covers and moved in slow, circular motions. The pan's lid had holes punched in it to allow heat to escape gradually without spilling embers. Users had to be careful not too long in one spot, or they could scorch the sheets, crack the feather bed, or worse, start a fire. Servants or family members usually performed the task. The ritual was a delicate dance. Retrieve coals from the fire. Place them in the warming pan. Insert the pan between the sheets. Move it steadily to spread heat. Remove it before the sleeper entered the bed. The lingering warmth made sliding into bed bearable, sometimes even pleasant. Ashes, sand, and brick, alternative heat sources. Warming pans weren't available to everyone. In poorer households, other materials were pressed into service. Some people used cloth sacks filled with warm ashes, tightly bound and wrapped in another cloth layer. Others employed sand heated by the fire, which held warmth surprisingly well. Perhaps most common were heated bricks or stones, known as bed warmers or foot bricks. These were placed near the fire until hot, wrapped in cloth or placed in wooden boxes, slid under the covers at the foot of the bed. Stones retained heat for hours, and though not as effective as embers, they posed less risk of fire. Many families designated a specific stone as the bed rock or sleep stone, passed down and reused winter after winter. Foot warmers and personal heat boxes. Closely related to bed warmers were foot warmers, small, often box-shaped containers designed to warm the feet while seated or in bed. These were particularly common in churches, carriages, and cold bedrooms. A typical foot warmer had a wooden or metal frame, a perforated metal or clay insert, coals or stones placed inside, a handle for carrying. While primarily used outside of bed, foot warmers were sometimes placed at the foot of the mattress or under the bed covers, especially for those with circulation issues or the elderly. They served another function too: status symbols. Owning a decorative or imported foot warmer indicated wealth. Some were inlaid with brass, painted, or even etched with family crests. Sharing heat, people and pets as warmth sources. In the absence of warming devices, or alongside them, human and animal heat remained an essential source of warmth. It was common for people to sleep 2 or 3 to a bed, particularly in winter. Children, siblings, servants, or even guests might share close quarters for the sake of body heat. Pets, especially dogs, were valued not just for companionship but for warmth. Small dogs were encouraged to sleep at the foot of the bed or under the covers. In cold regions, cats also found their way beneath blankets, and their rhythmic purring provided both warmth and reassurance. In some peasant homes, livestock slept nearby. The warmth of a goat or pig was not romantic, it was practical. In extreme cases, people brought baby animals into bed with them to survive frigid nights. Bed curtains, canopies, and heat retention. Warming the bed wasn't only about adding heat, it was also about keeping it in. Enter the bed curtain, heavy fabric panels suspended around the bed, either from a canopy, four-poster style, or attached to ceiling beams. These served to block drafts, trap body heat, provide privacy, reduce the impact of cold stone walls. The tester bed, with full drapes on all sides, became popular in noble homes for this very reason. Even a mildly warm bed would stay warmer longer when enclosed. Some people used additional blankets hung from ceiling hooks to create makeshift canopies. In monasteries and military barracks, shared curtain rods allowed for partial privacy and heat control. Curtains did more than warm the body, they turned the bed into a miniature room, a sanctuary against the cold world. Evening rituals and the warmth of habit. As the need to warm the bed grew into a nightly routine, a set of evening rituals evolved across households. In noble homes, a servant might prepare the bedchamber, stoke the hearth one last time, retrieve the warming pan from the kitchen, place the foot warmer in the proper spot, lay a hot brick at the bottom of the mattress, shake out the covers and fluff the pillows. In peasant homes, a parent or elder sibling might remove the stone from the hearth, wrap it in a cloth and place it on the straw tick, gather children close before blowing out the candle. These rituals weren't merely practical, they created a psychological readiness for sleep. The warm bed signaled safety, care, and the ending of the day's labors. The act of warming the bed was as important as the warmth itself. Dangers of heat, fires, and fatal mistakes. But with fire came risk. Historical accounts tell of warming pans forgotten in beds, igniting sheets or straw mattresses. One 15th century household record from northern England notes the loss of a feather bed and 2 blankets to ye sudden flame of an ember pan ill-placed. Other dangers included burns from overheated bricks, carbon monoxide poisoning in small, poorly ventilated rooms, scorch marks on expensive linen. To avoid these, some households used woolen pads or folded furs between the pan and sheets. Others kept warmers at the foot of the bed only. And in monasteries, warming pans were banned altogether in certain orders for safety and austerity. Despite this, the use of heat at bedtime remained widespread, worth the risk for a few moments of comfort. The warmth beneath the sheets was not taken for granted. Whether from glowing embers, hot stones, bundled pets, or the embrace of another body, the effort to chase the chill away was constant. These tools, humble, practical, often handmade, tell us how profoundly people valued sleep, and how much labor and attention went into making it bearable in a cold, drafty world. But as technology advanced, how did these traditions change? When stoves, bricks, and pipes began warming rooms instead of beds, what happened to the tools once tucked under linen sheets? The hearth glows faintly as the warming pan cools in the corner. The stone you wrapped in wool has lost its heat. The bed curtains are drawn, the rushes underfoot are silent, and the bed itself, once chilled, now slightly warm, is finally still. But these tools, warming pans, foot warmers, bricks, and hot stones, were more than household gadgets. They were symbols, rituals, and heirlooms. In this second section of Story 4, we delve deeper into the social and cultural significance of bed-warming tools, who used them, who made them, and how their presence or absence reflected class, care, and creativity in the everyday life of a cold world. Making the tools of warmth. The manufacture of warming pans and other heat devices involved a variety of artisans. Coppersmiths or brass workers shaped the pan itself. Carpenters made the handles often long, smooth, and turned. Blacksmiths forged hinges and latches. Potters crafted clay bricks or warmers for lower-income homes. By the 15th century, warming pans became standardized enough to appear in trade inventories. Designs varied. Some had ornate lids punched with floral or geometric patterns, while others were plain and functional. In wealthier homes, these tools were commissioned engraved with initials, house crests, or religious symbols. In rural homes, warming pans were often hand-me-downs, repaired and reused until the metal thinned or the lid no longer latched. Warmth as a sign of wealth. Bed-warming tools reflected social hierarchy as clearly as tapestries or silver cutlery. Noble homes had multiple warming pans, often one per chamber. The finest were made of polished brass, sometimes with decorative handles inlaid with bone or horn. A warming pan might be listed in a dowry or passed down as a family item. In merchant households, the tools were more utilitarian. A well-used copper pan, a hot brick wrapped in linen, or even a repurposed cooking pot filled with sand might serve the same purpose. Peasant homes used what was available. Large stones heated in the hearth. Bags filled with dry beans or oats, warmed and wrapped. Clay pots with coals, carefully covered with wool. What mattered was resourcefulness, not refinement. In each case, the purpose was the same: to drive the night's chill out of the bedding. Household ritual and bedtime labor. The task of warming the bed was part of a broader pattern of evening domestic labor, usually assigned to women or servants. In manorial households, it was often a maid's duty to prepare the bedrooms after supper. Refluff pillows. Turn the mattress. Add extra bed coverings. Insert the warming pan. The pan would be moved gently in circular motions for a few minutes, sometimes left under the sheets near the foot, and removed just before the lord or lady entered. In smaller households, mothers often managed this task, ensuring children's beds were warmed first. In monastic houses, older or infirm monks were granted warming tools as a concession, while younger novices endured the cold for humility and discipline. These rituals were invisible but vital, performed quietly each night as part of the unspoken language of care. Superstition, safety, and the magic of heat. As with all things domestic in the medieval world, superstition accompanied even the most mundane practices. Some believed warming pans had the power to ward off illness or spirits. Bed warming was linked with cleansing not just of cold, but of lingering night forces. A hot pan symbolized health and protection. Certain herbs were burned alongside embers: sage, rosemary, or lavender, believed to purify the bed and soothe dreams. In Germany and Scandinavia, there were traditions of placing a heated stone under the bed on Christmas Eve to protect against the cold touch of spirits. In parts of Britain, a warm brick wrapped in red cloth was left near a baby's cradle to ward off chills and bad luck. Even the shapes of the punched holes in warming pans took on meaning. Some featured crosses, stars, or hearts, acting as symbols of faith and warmth. Yet not all associations were benign. Fire was dangerous. Carelessness with a warming pan could result in disaster. A scorched featherbed might smoke for hours before igniting fully. Entire homes were lost due to improperly cooled coals. This dual nature, comfort and threat, gave warming tools a quiet reverence. Inventories and wills, warmth in the records. Household inventories from the late medieval period frequently list warming pans among a family's possessions. In English wills from the 15th and 16th centuries, a warming pan might be bequeathed to a daughter or daughter-in-law. These entries often appeared alongside linen sheets, feather beds, and bed curtains, a cluster of sleeping-related items that formed the core of a woman's domestic dowry. For example, item to my eldest daughter, one brass warming pan with oak handle, the same as lay in my chamber. In some cases, servants were gifted the tools they had used, especially older women who had cared for children or prepared beds for decades. These documents show us something deeply human, that even the tools of warmth were cherished, not discarded. Travel in the portable hearth. Warming tools traveled. Nobles on progress or pilgrimage carried warming devices with them. Retainers would pack folding fire pans, small braziers, or clay bed warmers for overnight use in inns, castles, or tents. In winter, it was expected that a traveling noble's chamber would be warmed before their arrival. Some warming pans were built into travel trunks, with compartments for coals or herbs. Wealthy households had bedrolls that included wrapping stones or hot water pouches, an early version of the portable heater. This attention to warming shows just how critical nighttime comfort was, even on the road. A cold bed was not just unpleasant, it was viewed as bad for morale, bad for the body, and bad for the soul. Generational wisdom and the passing of warmth. The knowledge of how to warm a bed properly was part of family tradition. It was taught from mother to daughter, servant to apprentice, elder to youth. Instructions might include how long to heat a stone, how to test a pan's temperature on your wrist, which herbs to burn for which ailments, where to place a foot warmer for maximum effect. These skills were rarely written down, but everyone knew them. They were part of seasonal rhythms, like laying fresh rushes, tightening bed ropes, or beating blankets clean in the spring. The continuity of these practices tells us something profound. Comfort was learned, practiced, and passed on like a family story. Warmth as a daily victory. At the end of a long day of labor, prayer, travel, or toil, warmth was a quiet triumph. In an era where so much was uncertain, disease, war, famine, cold, a warm bed symbolized stability. It wasn't always guaranteed, and it was never perfect. But for a few hours, it created a cocoon against the stone, the frost, the wind. Each foot warmer, each pan of coals, each glowing brick wrapped in rags represented a small victory over the elements, over discomfort, over the long, dark night. And in those moments, sleep became not just possible but sacred. But warmth didn't stay forever. The stone cooled. The coals turned to ash. Eventually, new technology, stoves, chimneys, flues would begin to heat the room instead of the bed, and in doing so, they would reshape how people prepared for sleep. So what happened to these tools when entire rooms could be warmed? Did the loss of the warming pan change how people understood comfort and closeness at night? The coals have cooled. The warming pan, once passed nightly from hearth to bed, now rests unused in a corner. A new kind of warmth is spreading, steadier, broader, and less intimate. The fire no longer needs to be brought to the bed. Now, the room itself can be warmed. We trace the decline of the warming pan and its kin. As home heating evolved from hearths to stoves, from stoves to radiators, so too did the rituals of going to bed. With the slow arrival of room-wide warmth, people didn't just stop heating their beds. They began to sleep differently, dress differently, and even dream differently. The rise of the heated room. The turning point came with the gradual development and refinement of enclosed stoves, especially in Northern and Central Europe. Open hearths, while charming, were inefficient. Much of their heat escaped through the chimney. By the 16th and 17th centuries, masonry stoves, such as the Kasselofen in Germany or the tiled stoves of Scandinavia, became increasingly common in well-to-do households. These devices used less wood, held heat longer, could warm entire rooms evenly. Unlike an open fire, which required tending throughout the night, a well-built masonry stove radiated heat for hours even after the fire inside had gone out. With this shift, the center of warmth moved from the bed to the room. The sleeping space became a beneficiary of broader architectural changes. No longer did people have to fight nightly for a few degrees of comfort between the sheets. Chimneys and fireplaces, warming the air. Simultaneously, the spread of brick chimneys and flued fireplaces allowed fires to be placed in individual rooms without filling them with smoke. Once reserved for great halls and kitchens, bedchamber fireplaces became common in noble homes and eventually upper-middle-class dwellings. These fireplaces, though smaller than their great hall counterparts, provided localized heating that reduced dependence on portable bed warmers. And yet, they didn't completely eliminate the need for other tools, at least, not right away. Many homes still relied on brick foot warmers or warmed bedding to supplement the fire's heat, especially in colder climates or during extreme winters. But the transition had begun. From isolated warmth to ambient warmth, from effortful preparation to passive comfort. How bedtime rituals changed. As bedrooms warmed, the rituals of preparing the bed shifted. The warming pan, once essential, became occasional. The hot brick, once a nightly fixture, became redundant. Layering of bed curtains for heat became less necessary. People no longer had to crawl into bed quickly to trap heat. There was more lingering, more reading, more time spent seated at a vanity or by the hearth before sleep. Dressing gowns and slippers grew in popularity not just for warmth, but for leisure. The bedroom became a space not only for sleeping, but for relaxing. This subtle cultural shift, enabled by new heat technologies, changed how people understood nighttime itself. Insulation, glass, and the sealing of the cold. Another change helped transform the sleeping experience: better insulation. Early medieval homes were notoriously drafty, but by the 17th and 18th centuries, architectural innovations began to make airtight rooms more feasible. Glazed windows replaced simple shutters and oiled parchment. Plastered walls and lath and plaster ceilings reduced airflow between floors. Fitted doors and draperies helped contain warmth. These changes made it easier to keep a bedroom warm not just during the evening, but through the night. People began to leave fires burning longer. Some stoves were designed to be banked smothered with ashes to glow slowly overnight. In some areas, heated walls were introduced, using flues behind plaster to channel warm air. The idea that a person could enter a warm room and remain warm throughout the night without warming the bed directly was a radical improvement in comfort. The gradual obsolescence of the warming pan. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the bed warming pan had begun to vanish from everyday use in many urban households, though it lingered longer in the countryside and in colder regions. Inventories from the period show them declining in number, replaced by improved mattresses with insulating layers, blankets and quilts stuffed with down or wool, hot water bottles, a safer alternative to ember-filled pans. The warming pan became, ironically, a decorative object polished and hung on the wall or placed on display in kitchens and entryways. Some were passed down as heirlooms, symbols of domestic care, even if they were no longer used. In wealthier homes, they were replaced by copper hot water bottles, sometimes covered in velvet or wool and filled with boiled water instead of fire. These were safer, easier to manage, and reusable. The persistence of tradition in cold regions. Even as cities modernized, rural areas held on longer to the warming pan and its cousins. In Scottish crofts, French mountain villages, and Eastern European cottages, heating the bed remained a nightly necessity well into the 19th century. Wood was expensive, and rooms were often too large or poorly insulated to be heated entirely. In these places, warming pans were used with care and ceremony. Foot bricks were baked in communal ovens. Families still shared beds for warmth. The cold dictated conservatism in bedtime ritual. Even as technology spread, it didn't always reach or wasn't affordable to all. Literature and memory, the warming pan lives on. Though the tools faded from use, they lived on in literature and memory. Warming pans appear in Shakespearean stage directions, signifying domesticity. Victorian novels, recalling the old way of preparing the bed. Children's stories, where they symbolized care and tradition. Even today, the phrase "a warm bed" carries the emotional memory of effort and comfort. The idea that someone warmed the bed for you physically or metaphorically remains powerful. These simple tools, though obsolete, represent a form of intimate labor, now mostly invisible. Sleep transformed, from survival to sanctuary. Ultimately, the disappearance of warming tools reflected a new definition of sleep. No longer something to endure, sleep became something to enjoy. Heated rooms, thick mattresses, and breathable cotton sheets allowed people to stretch, breathe, and linger under the covers. Warmth became ambient, not targeted. People no longer needed to fall asleep shivering, waiting for the stone to cool or the embers to fade. The need to fight the cold every night slowly gave way to the idea that sleep should be restorative, not defensive. That shift, though gradual, transformed not just how we slept, but how we thought about sleep. In losing the warming pan, the hot brick, and the carefully rotated ember box, we lost something else, a daily encounter with discomfort and a ritual of resilience. But we gained something too: ease, leisure, and the ability to go to bed without bracing for a chill. And as sleep became softer and warmer, did it also become more distant from effort, from awareness, from the human touch? When machines heat our homes, who or what now tucks us in? Story 5. Shared beds, shared stories. Communal sleeping in the Middle Ages. Night has fallen over the manor house. The great fire in the hall has been banked, its embers glowing in the dim silence. In the chambers above, the lord and lady retire, but they are not alone. Beside them, a favored servant sleeps at the foot of the bed. In the room beyond, siblings curl together under furs. In the barracks, men sleep elbow to elbow on straw pallets, while in a peasant cottage, an entire family crowds into a single space, limbs tangled, breaths shared. To the modern mind, this might seem deeply uncomfortable. But in the Middle Ages, sharing a bed was the norm, not the exception. In this first section of Story 5, we explore how and why communal sleeping was such an integral part of medieval life, and how the shared bed became a center of warmth, safety, storytelling, and social cohesion. The communal bed, ubiquitous, practical, essential. In an era without insulation, central heating, or reliable security, beds were often large, shared, and multifunctional. Why did people share beds? Warmth. Sharing body heat was a survival tactic, especially in cold climates. Space. Most homes had very few rooms, usually one or two. Private sleeping chambers were rare. Cost. Beds, mattresses, and blankets were expensive. It made practical sense to consolidate. Safety. Sleeping close to others provided protection, whether from intruders, wild animals, or bad dreams. From peasant households to noble manors, sleeping arrangements reflected these constraints. The social bed, occupied by multiple people at once, was a fixture of life. Family in the bed, parents, children, generations. In rural homes, a typical family bed might include parents and children and occasionally grandparents. Newborns slept with their mothers, toddlers wedged between siblings. Older children might shift to floor mats or benches but still slept nearby. Privacy in the modern sense didn't exist. There were no baby monitors, no separate nurseries. A child's cries were muffled not by distance, but by the closeness of bodies around them. And that closeness created bonds. Families whispered, sang, prayed, and argued in bed. They told stories. They remembered the day's events. The bed wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a place to be together. This intimacy was practical but also cultural. In agrarian societies, sleep was divided into segments. The first sleep began shortly after dusk. The second followed an hour or two of wakefulness in the night. During that time, people might talk quietly, get up to tend the fire, or even slip into another bed to visit family members. The noble bed: privacy, proximity, and prestige. Among the nobility, bed sharing followed different rules, but the concept was still familiar. A lord and lady shared a bed, of course, but they might also share it with servants or pages, sleeping on the foot of the bed or on pallets nearby. Guests, sometimes even of high rank, especially during travel. Children, especially the youngest, who often remained in the parental bed for years. In royal courts, sharing a bed was often a political act. Sleeping arrangements conveyed intimacy, trust, or favor. To be invited to share the bed of a monarch was to be marked as a close ally, not necessarily sexually, but socially. The term bedfellow, now rarely used, had a rich meaning in this context. It denoted closeness, shared trust, and nightly companionship. Monarchs, bishops, and nobles all had bedfellows, who might serve as advisors, guards, or even spies. Servants and shared quarters. In castles and large households, servants frequently slept in shared quarters, either in dormitory-like arrangements or on pallets placed near their master or mistress. Some were tasked with nighttime duties: attending to chamber pots, stoking fires, assisting with clothing or nightcaps, guarding entrances. These servants often slept in short bursts, fully dressed, and within arm's reach of their charges. Their presence was both functional and symbolic, a barrier between their lords and the vulnerabilities of night. In wealthier homes, nurses, wet nurses, and ladies-in-waiting also shared beds, especially with children. These relationships were intimate, often forming lifelong bonds between servant and child. Soldiers, monks, and bed as barracks. In monasteries, shared sleep was part of religious discipline. Communal dormitories, long halls of simple cots or straw beds were the norm. Monks slept in shifts, some waking for midnight prayers. Silence was often enforced, and sleep seen as a necessity, not a luxury. In military contexts, shared beds meant survival. Soldiers in the field slept shoulder to shoulder. In barracks, men often rotated beds, sleeping in 3 shifts on the same mattress, a practice known as hot bedding, because the next man would arrive while the warmth from the last still lingered. These arrangements, though functional, created deep camaraderie. Shared discomfort fostered shared stories. Laughter, secrets, and even songs passed from one man to the next in the space of a single night. The bed as a place of stories. Beyond warmth, beds were narrative spaces. In families, oral storytelling often took place at bedtime. Parents told saints, lives, cautionary folktales, or family histories. Children whispered riddles or jokes. Songs were sung. These moments of shared rest also became moments of shared memory. In households with no books, these were the bedtime stories, and the bed, not the hearth, was where many were told. This storytelling culture was deeply embedded. In some regions, folk tales were explicitly tied to nighttime ritual, with certain stories only allowed to be told in bed. They were thought to ward off nightmares or entertain the soul before sleep. Shared beds and social boundaries. Of course, bed sharing wasn't always innocent. While practical, shared sleeping arrangements also created opportunities for transgression. Affairs and secret meetings, especially in crowded noble homes. Scandal, such as servants or apprentices being found in the wrong bed. Tensions, when class, gender, or age boundaries were crossed unintentionally or intentionally. Church records, court cases, and parish logs often include references to inappropriate bedfellowship. Sometimes this meant sexual misconduct. Sometimes it simply meant suspicion or rumor. Still, most bed sharing was unremarkable a fact of life. People made space. They arranged themselves carefully. The goal was sleep, not drama. Regional customs, variations in the shared bed. Bed sharing took slightly different forms across Europe. In Scandinavia, enclosed box beds provided a level of semi-privacy, but were often shared by multiple family members. In France, the term coucher ensemble referred to formalized family sleep spaces. In Italy, wealthier urban families began to build bedrooms with multiple beds, but still kept young children in the marital bed. In England, the best bed in a home was often reserved for guests, a reflection of the social role of sleeping arrangements. Hospitality included not just food, but sleeping space. What it meant to sleep alone. Sleeping alone was unusual and often seen as undesirable. Only monks, widows, hermits, or the gravely ill slept apart from others. In some traditions, solitude in bed was associated with sorrow or penance. To be alone in bed was to be outside the warmth of family, community, or society. When the Reformation and Renaissance introduced new ideas about individuality, privacy, and morality, solo sleep began to emerge as a virtue, but that was still centuries away. In the medieval mind, to sleep beside another was to be safe, seen, and human. Beds in the Middle Ages were not just places for rest, they were sites of intimacy, economy, labor, and memory. Sharing a bed meant sharing life, its warmth, its burdens, and its stories. But as ideas about cleanliness, privacy, and architecture began to shift, how did shared sleeping begin to fall out of favor? When did people start desiring solitude in the night? The great hall grows quiet. A single candle burns in a corner, but this time the bed holds only one sleeper. No servant curled at the foot, no child tugging at the blanket, no sibling whispering in the dark. Something has changed. In this section, we trace the gradual shift away from communal sleeping in the Middle Ages. Over the course of centuries, privacy and individualism began to reshape how and with whom people went to bed. New ideas about space, cleanliness, morality, and personal identity began to disentangle the shared bed, one sleeper at a time. From hearth to chamber, the architectural evolution. In the early medieval world, most families lived, worked, cooked, and slept in a single room. Beds, if they existed, were clustered near the hearth. Privacy was functionally non-existent. But by the 14th century, homes, especially among the wealthy, began to reflect hierarchical layouts. The solar, or private upper chamber, became common in manorial estates. Townhouses added upper floors, separating sleep from work and meals. Wealthier homes featured separate rooms for children, guests, and servants. This structural change allowed for greater segmentation of sleep. Rooms could be assigned. Beds could be placed behind doors. Curtains were no longer the only barrier between sleep and the world. The architecture of the home began to align with a desire for solitude. Ideas of modesty and moral reform. As the Renaissance approached, and especially during the Reformation, attitudes toward the body, modesty, and moral conduct began to shift. Religious leaders began to critique mixed-gender sleeping, especially between servants and employers. Promote modesty during sleep, encouraging fuller coverings and fewer shared beds. Suggest that solitude allowed for reflection, while crowds encouraged temptation. This didn't instantly change behavior, but it introduced a discomfort with older norms. By the 16th century, many Protestant regions discouraged unrelated adults from sharing beds. In some areas, apprentices were no longer allowed to sleep with masters, children, and bed sharing between unmarried adults became grounds for suspicion. Thus, sleeping apart became not only an architectural shift, but a moral prescription. The rise of cleanliness, bodies, and bedding. Alongside growing concerns about morality came rising attention to cleanliness and hygiene. While bathing was still infrequent, the body was increasingly viewed as a source of pollution capable of spreading illness and emitting unpleasant odors. Shared bedding, once normalized, came to be seen as risky or distasteful. Written accounts reflect this change. Guests began requesting fresh sheets before sharing beds. Travelers noted their reluctance to lie with strangers. Parents began moving older children out of the marital bed earlier. The association of cleanliness with individual bedding took hold. A bed no longer belonged to a group, it became a personal space, a hygienic zone. Commerce, inns, and the emerging distaste for shared beds. Inns and taverns were slow to adapt. Through much of the medieval period, it was common for strangers to share beds at inns, especially during festivals or high travel seasons. Travelers would rent the bed, not the room, and were assigned space beside whoever was already there. This led to widespread accounts of stolen goods, bed bugs and fleas, unpleasant or unwelcome company. By the 17th century, innkeepers began advertising private beds at higher cost for discerning travelers. The growing merchant class, increasingly protective of privacy and comfort, fueled this trend. This was the start of commercial privacy, a growing belief that you shouldn't have to share sleep with a stranger just because space was limited. The royal shift, solitude as a symbol of status. In royal and noble circles, the movement towards solitary sleep had begun earlier, but for symbolic reasons. By the late medieval period, it was becoming more common for monarchs to sleep in private, separate from their consorts. Ladies to have personal chambers, guarded and curtained off. Ceremonial bedchambers to exist purely for show, while actual sleep took place elsewhere. Solitude became a mark of refinement. To sleep alone signaled wealth, you had enough rooms for separation. Power, no need for servants to protect you through the night. Control, you governed your body and space independently. By the 18th century, solitude and sleep became the default for the powerful, not the punishment of the exiled. The invention of the personal bed. As architectural, cultural, and moral forces converged, the personal bed emerged. Beds began to reflect the individual. Monogrammed linens, custom-fitted mattresses, personalized pillows and blankets. By the 17th century, inventories often listed several beds per household, each linked to a specific person. Children were assigned their own cribs or cots. Guest rooms had individual beds, even if rarely used. This development wasn't universal, but it was aspirational. To have a bed just for you was to have a space for rest, reflection, and control. Privacy, dreams, and the inner life. As sleep became solitary, dreams took on new significance. In the medieval communal bed, dreams were shared, retold, interpreted aloud. With individual sleep came a private dreamscape, no longer publicly narrated, but pondered silently. Writers of the Renaissance and Enlightenment began to explore the subconscious as a realm of personal meaning, the bedroom as a space of reflection, sleep as a metaphor for death, rebirth, or revelation. The solitude of sleep allowed for an interior life to emerge, introspective, private, and in some ways modern. Not for everyone who still slept together. Despite these shifts, communal sleeping never fully disappeared, especially among the poor in both cities and rural areas. Servants and apprentices sharing quarters for decades. Large families, particularly in tenement housing or agricultural labor camps. Even as personal beds became ideals, economic and spatial realities often overruled cultural trends. Shared beds endured out of necessity. In many cases, people chose to share beds even when they didn't have to. Elderly couples, widows and grandchildren, traveling companions, some found in shared sleep the comfort that solitude could not provide. what we lost and gained when we stopped sharing. The retreat from communal sleeping brought undeniable benefits: greater privacy, improved hygiene, emotional boundaries, architectural innovation. But something was lost too: shared warmth, midnight whispers, the comfort of knowing you weren't alone in the dark. The solitary bed brought peace, but also distance. We gained independence, but we lost a kind of collective rest, a sense of night as a shared experience. The bed, once a hearth unto itself, a place of stories, survival, and shared humanity, had become a private island. And with that transformation, sleep itself became a solitary act, more introspective, less communal. But in times of war, hardship, or exile, did people return to the shared bed? What happened when disaster struck and the old instincts of warmth and proximity returned? The bed stands quiet and solitary until the knock at the door. A cousin fleeing war arrives. A neighbor's cottage has burned down. A plague grips the village, and suddenly the household is full again. The guest bed is filled, then the floor. Then, finally, the once private bed becomes a shared refuge again. In this final section of Story 5, we examine the cyclical nature of shared sleeping, how moments of disaster, upheaval, or hardship repeatedly push people back into the age-old habit of sleeping close together. The shift to private sleep was not a clean or complete break. Under pressure, people rediscovered the warmth, comfort, and necessity of sharing a bed. Wartime sleep, crowded barracks, and makeshift quarters. Throughout history, war has disrupted the architecture of comfort. In times of invasion, siege, or forced relocation, private beds quickly vanished. Refugees crammed into barns, abbeys, and the homes of distant relatives. Soldiers returned to hot bedding, rotating in and out of shared mattresses. Makeshift hospitals filled every available bed with the sick and dying. In castles under siege, noble families might find themselves sleeping in the same hall as their servants' rank and privilege dissolved by necessity. Stories from the 100 Years' War, the Wars of the Roses, and countless regional conflicts speak of people lying shoulder to shoulder, waiting not for rest, but for news. In such moments, the bed once again became a communal shelter, a reminder that even in an age of rising privacy, the shared bed was never far away. Plague and pandemic, quarantines and closeness. Disease also redefined sleeping arrangements, sometimes in tragic ways. During outbreaks of plague, particularly the Black Death, 1347–1351, whole families often died in the same bed, having refused to separate even as symptoms appeared. In their final hours, many chose closeness over caution. Others, however, consolidated households to reduce risk. When servants fled, relatives moved in to care for children or the elderly. Beds were shared not for love but for lack of alternatives. Later outbreaks like the Great Plague of 1665 saw entire city blocks quarantined. Inside locked homes, people slept wherever they could. Shared beds, long out of favor in cities, returned briefly out of desperation. These moments underscored a truth long known but often forgotten. In crisis, the instinct to be close reasserts itself. Disaster and displacement, sleeping where one can. Natural disasters, fires, floods, famines also restored the communal nature of sleep. In the aftermath of the Great Fire of London, 1666, thousands were displaced. Families slept in tents, churches, or open fields. Strangers shared blankets. Privacy was not just absent, it was irrelevant. When cottages burned or collapsed under snow, surviving neighbors took in the newly homeless. These guests didn't sleep in spare rooms. They shared beds, benches, or bundles of straw. Sometimes, the only gesture available was to make room. These acts of shared sleeping became acts of solidarity, signs of community survival against impersonal catastrophe. Seasonal labor and the sleeping farmhand. Even outside crisis, economic hardship or seasonal necessity often force people back into bed-sharing arrangements. Farmhands during harvest season frequently slept in shared lofts, barn corners, large communal beds in outbuildings. These were not always comfortable arrangements. They were often rough, itchy, and smelly, but they worked. People adapted. Sleep came through exhaustion, not luxury. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as industrialization drew workers to cities, new forms of working-class communal sleeping emerged. Factory dormitories, shared boarding house beds, lodging house rotation, where people paid for a corner of the bed by the hour. The shared bed, while diminishing in idealized family homes, remained very much alive among the poor and the transient. Nostalgia for the shared bed, memory and sentiment. By the 19th century, with the rise of middle-class values and the spread of private bedrooms, communal sleeping began to be remembered nostalgically. Elderly memoirists recalled sharing beds with cousins during holidays, the warmth of being huddled with siblings in winter, the bedtime stories told by grandparents from the middle of the bed. Children's books of the Victorian era often romanticized these memories, even as actual practice declined. The coziness of the shared bed remained in culture long after it was gone from households. This created a double image. On one hand, the private bed became the standard of civilization. On the other, the shared bed became a symbol of simpler, warmer times. Modern echoes when we still sleep together. Even today, the shared bed reappears. During blackouts or storms, families huddle in one room. At campsites, tents are shared. In hospitals or emergencies, people sleep in shifts on couches, chairs, or together on the floor. In these moments, sleep returns to its ancient shape, pragmatic, layered, and shared. Even the rituals persist. A parent calming a feverish child by holding them close. Siblings giggling under a blanket at a sleepover. Friends traveling abroad, sharing beds to save on costs. Though our homes are built for solitary rest, our instincts are not. The weave of human sleep, what shared beds teach us. Throughout this story, we've seen how the bed is not just furniture, it is a social space, a container of relationships. To share a bed is to accept another's breath and dreams, offer warmth and accept need, share silence, stillness, and trust. These moments, mundane and profound, have shaped human culture for centuries. The move away from them was not just about hygiene or space. It was about how societies imagine connection. In many ways, the solitary bed is a triumph of autonomy, comfort, and choice. But in moments of darkness, disaster, or deep need, we still reach out not just for help, but for proximity. And maybe that's the lesson of the medieval bed, that while we may prefer to sleep alone, we are not meant to be alone. Today, most of us assume that sleep is personal, private, best done in quiet, in darkness, in solitude. But for most of human history, sleep was a shared state, not just in space, but in stories, fears, rituals, and warmth. So when we ask, how did they survive the cold, the fear, the long nights? The answer is simple. They didn't sleep alone. Story 6, Window Shutters and the Cold Light, blocking out the night in the medieval world. You're lying in bed. The fire has died down to a faint glow. Outside, the wind moans like a low chant. There are no curtains, no double-paned glass, just a wooden shutter closed against the cold. Through the cracks, moonlight creeps in. A draft kisses your feet. You pull the wool blanket tighter and wonder what moved in the darkness outside. Before central heating, before storm windows, before even window panes, there were holes in the wall, the earliest windows in medieval homes. In this section, we explore how people in the Middle Ages fought the elements not just through bedding, but by battling what entered or escaped through their windows. It's a story of shutters, oiled parchment, animal skins, and architectural improvisation. a story of darkness, light, airflow, and the quiet war between comfort and exposure. What was a window, really? In modern times, we take the window for granted, a glazed, fixed, transparent pane of protection and visibility. But for most of the medieval period, a window was not a window in the way we understand it. The term window comes from the Old Norse vindauga, meaning wind eye. And that's precisely what it was. An opening to let in light, yes, but also to let in air, noise, and cold. In peasant cottages, windows were simply holes in the wall, covered with a wooden shutter or nothing at all. Manorial houses might have openings with wooden frames, sometimes crossed with thin latticework. Churches and monasteries featured high, arched windows often open to the elements or filled with stained glass if wealthy enough. Glass was rare and expensive. For centuries, it was reserved for cathedrals, castles, and abbeys. Most people had no glass windows at all. Shutters, the first line of defense. To block the wind and night, most households used wooden shutters. These were not decorative accents, they were functional necessities. Shutters were made of thick timber, often oak or chestnut, hinged on the outside or inside, depending on the region, secured with iron latches, wooden pegs, or even stones. At sunset, families would close the shutters from the inside, sealing out the cold and securing the home. In some areas, shutters were double-layered, an outer flap and an inner board, with a layer of wool or moss between them for added insulation. Shutting the windows was not just about comfort, it was about safety. In walled towns, it kept out thieves. In rural areas, it kept out animals or worse. Alternative coverings, parchment, linen, and skins. For those who could not afford glass, but wanted to block wind while allowing some light, creative solutions emerged. People used oiled parchment, thin sheets of scraped animal skin treated with oil to make them translucent. These let in light while keeping out wind. Woolen cloths, hung over openings and changed seasonally. Animal membranes, stretched and dried to create a rudimentary window pane. Horn windows, thin slices of animal horn, flattened and polished, used in some wealthier homes as semi-transparent covers. These coverings weren't clear. You couldn't see out of them, but they glowed with daylight and blocked the worst of the drafts. Regional differences in window use. Window design varied across Europe. In Scandinavia, where winters were harsh, windows were small and often kept shuttered nearly year-round. Openings were minimized to conserve heat. In Italy and southern France, larger openings allowed for airflow during hot summers. Here, shutters helped regulate temperature, not just keep out the cold. In England, timber-framed homes featured casement windows, hinged wooden panels, sometimes combined with lattices. Even in the same village, window arrangements differed based on class, craft, and need. A weaver might want more light, a baker less. A priest might insist on a shutter that opened toward the rising sun. The constant battle with drafts. Even with shutters, the cold found its way in. Medieval texts often complain of whistling winds that pass through the cracks, smoke that leaves not by the roof, but through the wall, the sting of frost upon the footboards. People stuffed moss, rags, or sheep's wool into window gaps. In some regions, windows were bricked up entirely for winter. Still, most homes remained cold. That cold shaped behavior. Beds were moved away from windows. Tapestries were hung on walls to cover windowed areas. People slept in hoods or with their heads beneath blankets. The window, though a source of light, was also a portal for hardship. Light and darkness, the window's dual nature. A window was both blessing and curse. During the day, it offered illumination in homes where candles and rushlights were expensive. A well-placed window allowed a family to spin wool by daylight, bake with sunlight on their hands, Watch for visitors or dangers approaching. But at night, the window became an eye that watched and was watched. Even closed, it allowed. Sounds from outside, footsteps, howls, rain. Imagined intrusions, spirits, thieves, shadows. Real ones too, rats, bats, even snakes. Stories abounded of witches flying in through windows, of ghosts tapping on shutters, of owls bringing messages in the dead of night. The window was never fully safe. Windows in castles and churches, power and prestige. In castles, windows took on new meaning. Arrow slits, narrow vertical openings, allowed defenders to shoot while minimizing vulnerability. These were not for light or comfort, they were about control. But in the lord's private chambers, windows might be larger, often with iron bars, covered with colored glass in the wealthiest households, shuttered with tapestries or woodwork. Churches, of course, had the finest windows of all, stained glass, often imported, sometimes created on site. These were not for warmth or airflow. They were spiritual, symbolic, and deeply costly. In contrast to peasant homes where windows let in the cold, in sacred spaces, they let in divine light. The domestic ritual of closing the window. Every night, someone had to close the shutters. In many homes, this was part of the evening routine. Bank the fire. Bring in the animals. Bolt the door. Shut the window. It was often a child's job or a servant. In stories and memoirs, this act becomes symbolic, closing off the world, securing the home, preparing for sleep. The sound of a shutter being latched was the sound of readiness for the night, and when the shutters rattled in the wind, it meant something was amiss or soon would be. Conclusion: the window as threshold. The medieval window was a paradox. It invited light and let in cold. It offered visibility and invited danger. It was essential and vulnerable, desired and feared. People covered it, reinforced it, peered through it, and told stories about what came through it. For centuries, sleep was shaped by how well your windows were sealed. A poorly latched shutter could mean a miserable night. A well-covered opening meant precious warmth preserved. But what happened when glass became common? How did transparency and permanence change the role of the window forever? A beam of sunlight pierces the window, not through a wooden shutter, not through stretched parchment or horn, but through glass, wavy, rippled, colored by age. You see your shadow on the floor. You see the outside world blurry, distorted but visible. Something has changed. In this section, we explore the gradual emergence of glass windows in the medieval world. While still a luxury for many centuries, glass began to reshape how people understood their homes, their privacy, and their connection to the outside world. Glass was more than a material, it was a signal of status, belief, and even moral philosophy. Early use of glass in windows, a privilege of the powerful. By the 12th century, glassmaking had returned to Europe, reviving after the decline of Roman techniques during the early medieval period. But for hundreds of years, glass remained extraordinarily expensive. Its use in windows was limited to royal palaces, cathedrals and monastic buildings, high-ranking noble households. In these places, windows might feature mullioned frames with small panes of hand-blown glass, leaded latticework holding together multiple diamond-shaped pieces, stained glass, especially in ecclesiastical settings, depicting saints, symbols, or biblical stories. The presence of glass signaled wealth, learning, and divine light. How was medieval glass made? Medieval glass was crafted through an intensive process. Sand and potash from wood ash were melted in a furnace. The molten mixture was blown into a sphere using a blowpipe. The sphere was spun into a crown, a flat disc with a characteristic bullseye in the center. That disc was cut into small panes, irregular and imperfect. The resulting panes were thick and uneven, with distortions and bubbles. Slightly greenish or bluish, depending on impurities. Fragile, requiring leaded frames for support. These glass panes let in light but distorted the view. Still, for many, they represented a miraculous transformation, the ability to see outside without letting in cold air or pests. Light as a moral force, the theology of windows. In religious architecture, glass windows were not just decorative, they were theological tools. Church leaders believed that light was divine, and that stained glass filtered sacred light into sanctified forms, told stories to the illiterate, created a contemplative atmosphere through color and silence. The way glass transformed light symbolized spiritual transformation. The flickering reds, blues, and golds were not mere colors, they were experiences, intended to humble, uplift, or warn. Secular buildings adopted stained glass more slowly, but the belief that light mattered morally persisted. A well-lit room was not just comfortable, it was a sign of virtue, order, and harmony. Glass in the home, gradual integration. As the 14th and 15th centuries progressed, glass windows began to appear in more homes, first among the wealthy, then gradually among the merchant classes. Features of glass in domestic spaces included smaller windows due to the cost of each pane, use of leaded casements, often hinged to open outward, interior shutters still used at night for insulation. Even in wealthy homes, not all windows were glazed. It was common to have a mix of glassed and shuttered openings, with glass used primarily in solar chambers, libraries, or chapels. Glazed windows were not yet fixed in most places. They were installed in removable frames, taken down in summer for airflow, covered with woolen cloth or leather in winter to reduce heat loss. The dream of the fully glazed home was still far off. Sumptuary laws and the control of glass. In some cities, authorities tried to regulate glass use. Sumptuary laws in places like London and Florence limited the number or size of glazed windows a home could have unless the owner belonged to a certain guild or class. Glass became a social signal, and municipal leaders wanted to preserve visible class distinctions. A merchant might be fined for adding too many panes, imitating noble window designs, using stained or colored glass without religious justification. Thus, the window became not just an architectural feature, but a regulated symbol of class and taste. Visibility and vulnerability, a new relationship with the outside. Glass changed the psychological relationship between interior and exterior. With a shutter, you were either exposed to the outside or completely closed off. Glass introduced partial visibility. You could see out even when the window was sealed, but you could also be seen depending on the angle and light. This brought both comfort and unease. Writers began to speak of the transparent barrier, a concept now mundane but then unsettling. Could spirits pass through glass? Could curses? What did it mean to be watched without hearing? The window began to suggest a loss of control, as well as an increase in knowledge. Glass and cold, a complicated upgrade. Contrary to expectation, early glass windows were worse at insulation than thick shutters. Homes that switched to glazing faced increased drafts due to poor sealing around panes. Heat loss, especially through thin or broken glass. Difficulty in repair glass was fragile and costly to replace. To combat this, people added wooden shutters over glazed windows, closed at night. Thick tapestries or curtains to hang over interior frames. Double windows in some elite homes, an early form of insulation. For many years, glass was for light, not warmth. The trade-off was accepted but not without grumbling. A change in sleep and daily rhythm. As glass windows filtered light into homes, they slowly changed how people woke, worked, and watched. Morning light became more gradual, no longer a sudden burst when shutters were flung open. The transition from night to day softened. People began to rise earlier, or at least to stir more gently. Light entering through colored or wavy panes was diffused, contributing to a sense of quiet in the morning, more gentle indoor environments, a changing relationship with time and season. This changed how people slept, when they prayed, when they worked, and when they entertained guests. Light came not all at once, but in stained fragments and ripples. The window as symbol in literature and folklore. As glass windows became more common, they entered myths and metaphors. In late medieval poetry and storytelling, windows appear as symbols of longing, the lady gazing out; portals to magic, light falling on a child signaling destiny; barriers of class, peasants peering through manor windows. Stories even arose of windows weeping, of ghosts passing through panes, or of mirrors made from glass stealing the soul. Thus, glass windows were not simply technological improvements, they were cultural catalysts, reshaping language, metaphor, and the sense of self. The introduction of glass redefined the window from a purely functional opening into something symbolic, fragile, and expressive. It let in light and ushered in a new way of seeing and being seen. Yet, even as the world became more transparent, warmth remained elusive. In time, how would people finally reconcile transparency with insulation? What innovations allowed glass to become truly protective as well as enlightening? The fire flickers, the shutter is no longer necessary. Behind it, thick glass stands firm in its iron grid. The wind howls outside, but the room is still. Daylight enters gently, not biting. The window no longer breathes, it contains, and that changes everything. In this final section, we explore how the medieval window, once a hole in a wall, evolved into an essential architectural tool. We'll look at how engineering, craftsmanship, and changing cultural norms turned the once dreaded wind eye into an object of security, warmth, and even aspiration. From layered glazing to symbolic positioning, the window was tamed but never entirely trusted. From function to feature, the window as an element of design. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, windows had ceased to be just defensive or utilitarian. In new domestic architecture, especially in towns, they became statements of identity. This was most evident in the bay window, a protruding structure that caught more daylight and often faced public streets. Oriel windows, supported by brackets or corbels, used to project a noble or clerical presence outward. Transom windows, installed above doors or within rooms to allow the transfer of light internally. Increased glass availability allowed builders to think not only about where light entered, but how it was used to frame space, elevate design, and signal refinement. This marked a turning point. Light was no longer a threat or luxury. It was now an asset to be sculpted. Layering glass, the first storm windows. In an effort to improve insulation, some wealthier households began to experiment with multiple layers of glass. This was not the double glazing we know today, but a primitive version of it. Outer glass panes installed in thick casements, with a second inner frame. Use of interior shutters that remained closed through the night. Gaps between layers filled with fabrics or moss to reduce heat exchange. These homes were rare but influential. Over time, builders copied their strategies, and even modest homes began to insulate their windows better. In England and parts of the Low Countries, such developments would eventually influence Georgian window styles, but their roots lay deep in late medieval ingenuity. The glazier's craft, a window into specialization. As glass windows became more widespread, the profession of the glazier rose in prestige. Glaziers created individual panes using the crown glass or cylinder glass method. fitted panes into leaded frames, often requiring custom shaping. Maintained windows replacing broken panes, mending leadwork and cleaning soot. Glazing was difficult and expensive. Even when flat taxes and manufacturing advances began to lower costs, most homes still couldn't afford full glazing. But for monasteries, civic buildings, and merchant homes, having a reliable glazier became a point of pride, and their work was often recorded in household accounts. Windows became a sign not just of wealth, but of ongoing investment and care. Glass, fire, and safety, a new kind of vulnerability. As windows became larger and more prevalent, new concerns emerged, especially in dense urban settings. Fire spread rapidly in medieval towns. Wooden shutters had once been part of this problem, but now glass windows became points of both containment and risk. Iron bars were added to prevent break-ins, but they also trapped people inside during fires, shattered when the interior heated too quickly, allowed less airflow during hot, dry seasons. Some cities began regulating the placement and size of windows, particularly along alleys and above marketplaces, out of concern for fire propagation and structural strain. In essence, the more modern the window became, the more it invited questions about urban safety, sunlight and health, a new philosophy of air and light. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, the idea that fresh air and natural light promoted health gained traction. Physicians began to suggest airing out sick rooms through open windows, weather permitting, using southerly windows for sunlight in cold climates, avoiding northern shadows, which were considered damp and melancholic. Houses were increasingly designed with more windows facing east and south. People arranged beds and work tables by windows not just for light, but for the moral and medical benefits they were believed to offer. Though far from the germ theory of later centuries, this movement marked a shift. Windows were no longer feared solely as portals of wind or threat, they were now tools of health and harmony. Windows and the concept of the self. As transparent windows became commonplace, they subtly changed how people saw themselves and others. Windows created a two-way gaze, the idea that one could be watched from the street. Opportunities for reflection, both literal and figurative. New spatial norms about privacy, voyeurism, and self-presentation. In literature and painting, figures began appearing more often beside windows, watching, longing, hopping, hiding. The window became a metaphor for liminal space, between inside and out, known and unknown, seen and unseen. Such shifts, so subtle in their time, are now deeply embedded in modern thought, but their roots lie in a pane of wavy glass set in a wall where once there was only wind. Legacy of the medieval window. By the close of the Middle Ages, shutters were no longer the only defense against winter. Glass had spread far enough to become aspirational, if not yet universal. The idea of light entering safely had taken hold across Europe. The window had been transformed from a hole into a frame, of views, of status, of self. Still, in peasant homes and rural cottages, the shutter remained a fixture for centuries more. Even today, in many older buildings, the original shutter hardware survives, iron hinges rusted with time, whispering of nights long past. The medieval window reveals much about how people lived with nature, technology, and fear. It reminds us that comfort was never taken for granted, that every patch of daylight earned through glass was once a battle against wind and dark. Even today, we measure good sleep by the silence of a sealed window, by the peace of filtered light, by the privacy of a room undisturbed. And yet, when storms knock out the power or shutters slam in sudden wind, we remember the window has never stopped being a threshold and never will.